You did an excellent job with my name.
Oh,
Thank you.
terrific.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, thank you. So you did an excellent job with my name as well. Uh, so thank you so much for joining us. I want to begin. I mean, this is a very this book that you've done in Israel Palestine covers a lot of familiar territory for people who follow this conflict and are familiar with this history, but you take a different lens in a couple of very different in a couple of important ways. One, you're really talking about these two competing narratives that run through the course of the book. I want you, I guess, first to define and explain what is the core Israeli narrative and what is the core Palestinian narrative, and how do they situate themselves in their worlds?
The core is that both believe they are the rightful owners of the land. The Israeli narrative is that they own it by virtue of divine right, that they occupied the land 2,000 years ago, were driven out by the Romans in about 77 AD, and have been a wandering nation, dispersed throughout Europe ever since, and persecuted in every country they inhabited, and were persecuted badly in Spain in the 15th century, and of course in the 19th century were persecuted really badly by the Tsarist Russia. And out of that grew one form of Zionism, and that it's taking refuge in Palestine, the land that was theirs. Of course, Zionism would never have gotten off the ground, and that probably could be qualified, so I won't say that has been absolute, had it not been for the Balfour Declaration in 1917, when the then Secretary of State in Great Britain wrote a letter to Lord Rothschild saying that the British government looked favourably on the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And that's the you could say where the foundations of the emigration to Palestine was placed. On the other hand, the Palestinian narrative is that they simply occupied that land continuously for 1,500 years. And when the Jews first began to arrive at the beginning, at the turn of the century, the 20th century, they accepted them. But in time they began to see them as more and more came as colonists. At that time, no one ever thought of the Palestinians in terms of there being a Palestinian people. They were all lumped together with Arabs, and the Jewish position, which appears in the writings of Ben Gurion, was that, well, we can simply get rid of these Palestinians because there's lots of space in Arab lands and they're Arabs.
Right.
So,
Right.
Even in the mid-1970s, there was Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir who made the famous statement that there's no such thing as a Palestinian. And, of course, there is such a thing as a Palestinian, and they have their culture and have their traditions that are different from other Arab states, as one Arab state is different from another Arab state. So, even though as a result of the wars of 1948 and the establishment of the State of Israel, the Palestinians have not given up their claim to the land. Now, I should modify that, because the PLO, that's the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which, according to the Oslo Accords in 1993, was designated and accepted by Israel as the sole representative of the Palestinian people, agreed to give and accept the existence of Israel on the 78% of the land that it had won post the 1967 Six-Day War. and that there should be a Palestinian state on the remaining 22% of the land.
So, Professor, before we get into the mechanics of this two-state process and how it's sort of become, and I think particularly in this audience, there's a lot of familiarity with maybe the politics and the geographic realities and the the so-called facts on the ground that make a two-state impossible, and maybe there's also some recognition of. On some people's parts, I think there's certainly a kind of idealistic desire for a binational democracy, which I have sympathy for, but I think that there's a lot of very, very serious practical hurdles towards something like that happening in actuality. And I'd like to get to that later and maybe also draw on some of your experiences in Ireland and South Africa as well. But before we get there, I think along with this narrative structure, you talk about there's some kind of defining psychological states for Israelis and Palestinians that sort of filter both sort of broad general policies and experiences. And with Israel, you talk about security. And it's very interesting because, in the narrative you're building, and one of the things that strikes me as just sort of a fundamental asymmetry of this situation, because this is a fundamentally asymmetrical situation, as your book certainly recognizes, but that even though Israel has obviously been the victim of terrorist attacks from Palestinians, groups like Hamas or Islamic Jihad, and civilians have died, and that is a very real thing. There's also this history of security concerns that goes into the Israeli narrative that just have absolutely nothing to do whatsoever with Palestinians. They entirely predate them. Whereas the Palestinian core grievance or frame, you say, is humiliation. And that is everything from the politics and the realities of occupation and being under siege, and also just the, frankly, I think we could say pretty bluntly, racist and dismissive and sort of dehumanizing attitudes that Palestinians are held under. So, and that is all within the context of the modern reality of what it means to be Palestinian since, say, the 1940s and certainly since the 1960s. So talk about those two narratives and those two states, security versus humiliation, and how that kind of manifests itself in terms of impeding a solution.
Let's begin with the Israelis. I think the best way to understand Israel now is through its reaction to the Iranian nuclear deal. Here there is support across the left and the right for Benjamin Netanyahu's position that this is a bad deal and that it threatens Israel. The basis of their opposition, besides that it misreads a good part of the agreement, is that they simply do not trust the Iranians. Just as Iran has demonized Jews, by the same token, Israel has demonized Iran, and it simply does not believe that it will live up to any of the clauses in the agreement, and that the P5+1 will be hoodwinked. So there's an absolute lack of trust on their side. And trust is key to this, because if tomorrow morning, miraculously, some form of a two-state solution were put on the table for Israelis to consider, the very same objections would be made, because any two-state solution would have to be carried out in stages. And they would say, you simply can't trust. You cannot trust the Palestinians to carry out the provisions of this agreement. Any two-state solution would require the decommissioning of arms by Hamas. One, Hamas will never decommission its arms. And two, if it did commission its arms, rearming in the Middle East takes about 15 minutes. So they would never trust Hamas in that context of a two-state solution. They will never allow Hamas to be free in the West Bank. because once Hamas is in the West Bank, targeting every population center in Israel becomes immensely simple and immensely difficult to protect against. So absolute lack of trust. As I said, just as with the Iranian deal, you cannot trust them. They've hoodwinked you. They've taken you to the cleaner. You don't know what you did. You're bad negotiators. The very same kind of mindset, because they have this mindset of always looking, of not trusting the Palestinians. And why do they say that? They say that because in any poll that has been taken in recent years, until pretty recently, at least you would have a small number, and I must say a diminishing number, of Israelis who believe in a two-state solution. But they believe, if the follow-up question is, what do you think Palestinians would do with a two-state solution? There are about two-thirds of those who are willing to say they would accept a two-state solution believe that it would just be a first step on the part of the Palestinians to reclaim all of Palestine.
So, Professor, I'm sorry, finish your thought, and I need to interject about this before we get to the Palestinians. But sorry, complete your thought.
Sure.
Yeah.
I can finish with him. You can move on.
Oh no,
the Palestinians.
Before we get to the Palestinians, I think so. What complicates what you just outlined for me, and I have no doubt, and the book is impeccably researched, and you talk to people on the Israeli side, people on the Palestinian side, people in and out of politics, people in and out of power. It's a really fantastic book. But I think the challenge for someone like me, who, by the way, does have some Jewish and Irish heritage, in fact, but is okay. There is this sense of national trauma in Israel, and there certainly is, certainly anti-Semitism still exists in the world. There certainly are people that would like to engage in terrorism targeting Israel, and there are some people that would like to engage in terrorism targeting Jewish people, period, regardless of a nation state. But the challenge is that, when do we start picking apart the distinction between a national trauma and psychological state of a people and the fact that this is actually a powerful nation state that holds a totally asymmetric advantage over all of its opponents, including Iran? And no matter how nasty Iran's rhetoric might be, the reality is that we were seeing news reports over the weekend of, that this plan to possibly attack Iran that Ehud Barak was pushing, and Bibi Netanyahu was seriously considering. I mean, that was very close to happening. And if those sites in Iran were attacked, those nuclear sites, that basically would have been the equivalent of like detonating a dirty bomb in Iran. So you have a state, and the settlements never stop being constructed at any point. So when do you start to sort of distinguish between, okay, and just also I think it's important to add to this too, and you speak to this in your book as well, there's some people in the Israeli security establishment, not necessarily in the left or right politically, that will look at this Iran deal and say, hey, this is sensible, this is rational, and this makes sense just from a kind of realist perspective. But it seems like with Bibi and mainstream Israeli politicians, there's no way that we could get to yes. So when do we start saying, is this really about trauma and lack of trust, or is this just sort of becoming a cynical game to justify really untenable and wrong-headed policies? Does that make sense?
Yes, but let me answer that, because it's a very good question, and it's one I asked myself, which is why I went to such lengths in the book to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder and another disease, I won't call it a disease, a condition called continuous stress disorder. And a continuous stress disorder is one in which people fear and their trauma exists not because of what happens to them, but because of what may happen to them. And they have difficulty distinguishing between real threats to their well-being or to their security, and imagined threats to their security. So even though, as you say, and Israel is by far, by any means, the most powerful military machine in the Middle East, but people don't use the prism to look at things we look at them. They use the prism of associated with continuous stress disorder, and they fear things that may not be real. And to us, we would dismiss them as being silly or being just imagined. But imagined fear is as real fear, because fear is a feeling.
Right.
And whether it's imagined or real really doesn't matter. So what we can say, so we as outsiders are using a prism to look at the society that the society itself does not use to look at itself. So that's one problem for us in understanding them. The second thing is that over time, Israel has become an increasingly religious society, and young people in longitudinal studies show that the young people are becoming increasingly hardline, increasingly pro-Jewish, and increasingly willing to sacrifice part of democracy in order for there to be a Jewish state. And this is young people talking about on trending studies over a period of 12 to 15 years. So the generation that's coming up is tougher than the generation in place. And, while...
Yeah, I read something. I read that like 50% of the Palestinian kids, like teenagers, don't believe Palestinians should have the right to vote. It's wow. I'll bring that up later. Actually, let me see if I can find that now. Actually, history. Yeah, here it is. This shit is crazy. This shows how the indoctrination is happening. Half of all Jewish high schoolers say Arabs shouldn't vote. That's like this is like crazy. A new survey finds 59% of high school students consider themselves right wing. This is the opposite of America. This is from 2016, but I'm not sure. It's like it changed dramatically. And only 13%. This is like the flip side of what happening in America. That's why this is just a crazy situation happening over there. A new poll published Friday, half of Jewish Israeli high school students saying they believe Arabs should not have the right to vote. That's nuts. Because they, like the guy just said, they're not going to school. They're just getting indoctrinated. And they have, we'll just move back onto it. What we're doing here.
President Obama and other people kind of took Benjamin Netanyahu to task for his last-minute call on Israeli Jews to get to the polls because Palestinian Israelis were going to vote in droves, and said that was kind of racist.
I think so.
The point is,
but I understand
that the Palestinian people, the Israeli people, responded to that call. And this is a problem because many of the best of Israeli scholars, they're sociologists, they're psychologists, they're political scientists, have concluded that indeed Israel is a racist society, an ugly truth they have to face up to. They discriminate at every level against their own citizens, against Palestinian Israelis.
Against black
Not to
Jews,
talk about real
Ethiopians,
Palanis.
yeah.
I mean, at every level.
Yes.
And this is, and the society itself has so many fissures in it, like the Hardim will form 41% of the population in 2050. Now, the Hardim do not, and 1 in every 3 children in Israel goes to a Haredi school. That means 1 in 3 Israeli children at the moment are not learning science, they're not learning mathematics, they're not learning to live in the modern world. They're going to essentially religious schools. And this poses, leaving aside the West Bank and Gaza altogether, and just looking at the state of Israel itself, and the fissures that are running through it, means that in the future it faces huge internal problems. Like again, in the northern part of Israel, in about 10 to 15 years, Palestinian Israelis will be in a majority. So they'll actually be part of the state of Israel, in which Israeli Palestinians would be in a majority. Israeli Palestinians are looking for collective rights. They're looking for the rights of a minority. They're looking for, like any minority, then you could take the case of Northern Ireland. They're a minority of 20%. They'll be a minority of 25% in 10 years, and they're looking for some power sharing, some say in government that gives them representation to protect their rights. So looking at their economy, the picture, even though we hear about this growing picture of the Israeli economy, and it was a miracle, and it has an enormously innovative high-tech sector.
But lots of inequality, lots of stagnation, yeah.
And when you poll people in Israeli Jews, their greatest fear is not of Hamas, is not of war. Their greatest fear is of falling into poverty. 40%. In every election, the main issues are not should we have negotiations with the Palestinians over a Palestinian state? Should we try to find a way to end this conflict? Their main concerns are bread and butter issues. The cost of living, the shortage of housing always emerges. You've got to just recall the biggest rally ever in Israeli history in 2011, when over 400,000 people gathered in cities, and Tel Aviv in particular, marching non-violently, calling on the government for affordable housing. That's 400,000 people. It stunned everybody that so many people would come out on this issue. There's never been a demonstration of that type in its history. So while the rest of the world is saying, or the West is saying, you must get back to the table and you must talk and you must resolve this conflict. The fact of the matter is that once that barrier was built in 2002, after the suicide bombings and the Second Intifada, once that separation barrier was built, not only did it preclude Palestinians coming into Israel proper, but it also psychologically eviscerated Palestinians in the minds of Israelis. Right. They no longer had to think about them. There was no attack within Israel itself. As long as there's no attack within Israel itself, there's not a problem. That's why they didn't begin to revisit this until the war with Hamas in 2014.
So briefly, Professor, okay, so I want to actually get, before we wrap up, I want to get to the Palestinian narrative of humiliation, and then we'll have to circle this to why at this point, and it's sounding very clear why, because I think, again, what's so important about this book and what's really so devastating about this book in many ways is you're kind of, you're getting to some of the deeper variables. I think a lot of people understand why a two-state solution is impossible right now because of physical realities, but the psychological barriers might be even more problematic and more enduring. Get to the Palestinian narrative, and then maybe, you mentioned Northern Ireland before, maybe we could look to Northern Ireland and South Africa, other places that you've studied and been closely involved with, and see if there's any sources of parallel or hope that we could find from those examples.
Let me deal with the latter first.
Okay.
Israel takes great umbrage at being called an apartheid state. And I never used the word that they are an apartheid state in the book. But increasingly it is becoming an apartheid state.
Yeah, that's just a kind of reality. I mean, I don't think that that's a question of people being offended or not. I think that that's just in many ways a very just sort of objective description of what's happening there. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Let's deal with the humiliation, because you raised that a number of times. The humiliation arises from, in the West Bank, let's begin, from the fact that there are these checkpoints, barriers, roadblocks, bantustans, if you like, where they live, and they can be detained at will by the Israeli Defense Forces. The hunger strike recently was about a man who was under what's called euphemistically administrative detention. Mm-hmm. He was arrested for nothing. He was just detained, and you can be detained indefinitely. And the IDF can kind of raid your house. They can do anything they want, and they exist under military law. They are governed by military law, so they never. They're when they have a case against a member of the IDF, it never gets to court. It's never remedied. And there was a book that came out about 2 years ago where a large number of members of the IDF broke the silence, as it's called. The book was called Breaking the Silence. And it talked about how these soldiers would say that they would get bored in the West Bank, just doing patrols, so they would just arrest a couple of Palestinians just for the sake of doing it, to relieve the boredom. Wow. I recount one incident of a very senior Palestinian negotiator who, two of them, I'll just give these stories because it illustrates maybe better than anything. One of them said that it's more my dignity, regaining my dignity is more important to me than ever having a two-state solution. I want my dignity back as a human being. And the other said, he said, I always recall that some years ago I was stopped at a roadblock by a 19-year-old soldier who told me to get out of the car, kind of put my hands on the roof. And I had my little daughter of about 5 or 6 in the car, and they opened the boot and they went to just put under the car and kind of looked inside the car and made me open the various things on the dashboard. And then they said, okay, you can go. And he said, I felt utterly humiliated. And when I got into the car and my daughter said to me, Daddy, what happened? Why did they do that to you? I had no answer for her. I had no answer for her. And I never felt so humiliated. Now, the important thing, Michael, is that humiliation is an addiction. That might sound strange, but people who become humiliated look for circumstances in which they can be humiliated again in order to vindicate their saying that they are humiliated. And there's the literature of this. And it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but it is nevertheless true. So going back to the Israeli-Palestinian narrative, you can break it up into two bits. You have the people in the West Bank and the people in the Palestinian Authority, or the party of Mahmoud Abbas, Fatah, would settle for two states. And when we talk about negotiations, we talk about negotiating essentially with one part of the Palestinian community. Hamas believes in regaining all of Palestine, all of Israel. Now, it has a completely different agenda, and it's not at the negotiating table. So when we engage in these negotiations with Abbas and the Israelis, and the Hamas is left out of the picture.
Is that really entirely true?
It's like negotiations with Northern Ireland without having the IRA at the table. Now,
right.
today going on, in the last months, very reputable reports say that the Israelis are negotiating via Tony Blair and Turkey with Hamas.
Right.
That they want to reach a separate arrangement with Hamas, that in return for Israel lifting the siege, and that there was a ceasefire, or what they call a hudna, for 8 to 10 years, under which Hamas and Islamic Jihad would no longer fire anything at Israel, and in return the siege would be lifted. A seaport would be built in Gaza, and that could export goods to Cyprus. That would be to northern Cyprus.
And maybe do some energy exploration.
Sorry, the Turkish part. Yeah. And if that happens, it in a way it suits the Israelis completely, because it is on its way to completely bifurcating Palestine into two states.
Right.
A Gaza state and that's on its own, and then that relieves the demographic problem completely. And we've got to remember too that Hamas and Fatah are virtually at civil war with each other, and that one is Islamic, and the other is secular Muslim, and that even if you had a Palestinian state, you have the Palestinian West Bank economy.
Right.
Lives on donor support. The Gaza economy is brain dead. So part of the deal, if it ever came about with Israel on a ceasefire, would be that they would help in the reconstruction of Gaza, because at the rate materials are coming into Gaza today, it will take 30 years to restore Gaza to the state it was in 2014. There are still 100,000 people without homes who live in shelters.
Right.
It's at a snail's pace.
Right.
Virtually nothing has happened.
Right. So that's actually that raises. There's so many different variables here, but I guess this conversation could go on for hours, and it will go on, I guess, for years, unfortunately. But if you had to say, and I won't be as saccharine as say, hope, or in some respects, after reading your book and after this conversation, I think that there should just be sort of like a global raid of top-notch psychotherapists and trauma specialists dropped into Israel and Palestine to sort of deal with all of these internal issues you're talking about. But is, in the present circumstance, what, in your mind, if you have any, is the most tangible, or
like some sort of restorative justice kind of, just because you got to get to the bottom of it.
Or possible policy step or any other type of step that you could imagine that would move the ball forward in this in some way?
One would be that they're Palestinians, and there is the distinction between ending the occupation and establishing a Palestinian state.
Mm-hmm.
And the occupation of the West Bank must end as a precursor to any kind of solution. And that would entirely change the situation. all those roadblocks would come down. There would be civil rights. There would not be an Israeli military presence. There would be no more roadblocks. They would not live under military control. That would be of huge significance. End the occupation. And after that is done, then one can begin to talk more reasonably. The humiliation factor begins to diminish. One can begin to talk more reasonably what can be done to establish God knows what kind of outcome, because I don't know. You mentioned binationalism. If I were asked, what do I see down the road, I would probably say some kind of binational state. Mm-hmm. But the factor that we overlook, Michael, is that there is among segments of both population a deep hatred, not just a little bit of, and that did not exist in Northern Ireland, right, but actual hatred. And this is partly because of the way their children are educated. And they are educated really to demonize each other and to think of Palestinians as the other, and Palestinians are taught to think of Israelis as the other, not as human beings. And an Israeli general at a conference after Camp David in 2000 said, we will never be able to make peace with the Palestinians until we begin to treat them as human beings. That, in a way, wraps it all up. Mm-hmm. Each side willing to...
Can you discuss the idea that comes up occasionally, Moladette, Jordan? Look, I'm just learning about this myself, so if you have a video, you could probably watch that, but I can't personally know about that.
Accept each other as human beings. One other step I would suggest that worked in Northern Ireland, and it is called parity of esteem. Because in Northern Ireland, you had the nationalist Catholic narrative of history, and you had the Unionist Protestant narrative of history, mm-hmm, and they were two entirely different narratives. And by parity of esteem, it meant that I would say, Michael, you're a Unionist and a Protestant, and you have your narrative of history. I respect your right to have that narrative, mm-hmm, even though I disagree with every single bit of it. Mm-hmm. I respect your right to have it. And you would say to me, Pádraig, you're a Catholic.
If you have a video, you can link, we can watch it.
Nationalist, you have your version narrative of history. I respect your right to have that narrative, even though I disagree completely with it. So respect for each other's narratives, an acknowledgement that each respects the other's narrative, even though it is different, would bridge that cleavage between the two, would kind of bridge that kind of intersection where the narratives give rise to conflict.
Well, Pádraig O'Malley, the book is The Two-State Delusion, Israel and Palestine, A Tale of Two Narratives. I really, really appreciate your time today. And
thank you for giving it to me. I appreciate it too.
Thank you so much. Be well.
With Al Jazeera, the top stories this hour: more Israeli airstrikes on the Gaza Strip.
The apocalypse.
27 Palestinians killed.
Oh, fuck. Okay, well.
That is how we act. Is that why?
Including 9 children. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the intensity and the frequency of these attacks on Gaza will increase. Hamas and Palestinian armed groups in Gaza have also been firing hundreds of rockets into southern Israel. 2 women were killed in the city of Ashkelon. Last hour I spoke to Hussam Zumlot, who is the Palestinian ambassador to the United Kingdom. He says the government there in London has failed to condemn Israel's actions inside Al-Aqsa Mosque in occupied East Jerusalem.
Our Arab brothers and sisters are up for a very real test. This isn't a conflict in Gaza. This is a conflict at the heart of the Arab world, the heart of our civilization, that is Jerusalem. It started there. Israeli provocation is very clear. The Israeli blueprint and plan is very clear. Ethnic cleansing, the de-Arabization of Jerusalem, and it's live on TV, and this has been happening for a long time. But this time is very different. This time, Jerusalem, as it always does, unified the Palestinian people, as you saw in the streets of Gaza, in the streets of Jerusalem before it, in the streets of Palestinian cities inside 1948. Last night, all over, the Palestinian people are rooted and dignified now. And therefore, really, if the response does not merit and does not rise to the occasion, I believe the region will have so much to lose. However, if the region stands up now, Israel is facing a great deal of international criticism and an increasing international realization of the great injustices and the oppression that is happening. Criticizing the UK government for quickly condemning rockets, but failing to condemn the brutalization of our people over the last few weeks and in the long term, and also failing to condemn Israeli aggression in Al-Aqsa Mosque, injuring hundreds of peaceful worshippers.
Now, warning shots have been fired by US ships after what they say was a close encounter with armed Iranian vessels in the Strait of Hormuz.
This guy's turning inbound. The aft one's turning inbound. You got the flares, right? Yeah, I got the flares.
US officials accuse the 13 Iranian Revolutionary Guard boats of making unsafe maneuvers towards their Navy ships. This is the second such incident in less than a month, at the same time as world powers try to bring Tehran and Washington back into compliance with the 2015 nuclear deal.
This group of fast attack boats approached the U.S. formation at high speed, closing in as close as 150 yards. After following all the appropriate and established procedures involving ship's horn blast, bridge-to-bridge radio transmissions, and other ways of communicating, the Coast Guard cutter Maui, U.S. Coast Guard cutter Maui, fired approximately 30 warning shots from a 50 caliber machine gun. After the second round of warning shots, the 13 fast attack craft from the IRGCN broke contact.
Meanwhile, a former Iranian
is Jordan Palestine? That's something that a lot of people,
God.
I've heard some people make the claim that the British owned, British Manic Palestine was initially what is Israel and the West Bank and Gaza and Jordan.
Yeah.
And some people say, you know what, the vast majority of that was Jordan. That is the Arab state in a sense, you know.
Okay, so, and even I would even add to that, right? Early on, when it was divided, right, and it became known as actually Western Palestine, which was the territory between the river and the sea, and Eastern Palestine. Mm-hmm. And then it very quickly took on the name Transjordan.
But apparently, is the reason why it's called the West Bank?
Yes.
Because it's the West for it was.
The Jordanians named it. The Jordanians named it in 1949 as because it was the only part of Jordan that now sat on the west bank of the Jordan River. Right. That was also the moment where Jordan dropped the trans in front of their name.
Right.
And they were no longer Transjordan, they were Jordan. Why? Because trans on the other side of the Jordan. And now they were on both sides of the Jordan. So it became Jordan and not Transjordan. Yes, all true, all factually correct.
Yeah.
But today, let's look at the facts. Jordan today has a population that is absolutely a majority Palestinian.
Right.
Until there is a Palestinian government in place in Jordan, we can't call it Palestine.
Let's just say that was to happen. There was a Palestine suddenly.
Then it would be a Palestinian state. Then it would be a Palestinian state. But as of right now, I don't see the Hashemites ever giving up their control over the Jordanian territory. Let's just be real about reality. That is the case. Now, granted, even if that happened, I still think there would need to be a very meaningful conversation about what about the Palestinians who live in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, in what they would call Palestine, because I think as Jews we need to acknowledge something. You know, we sit around and we talk about how important this land is to us, and how it is, and especially Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. And we call it Judea and Samaria on purpose. We don't say that lightly. We're not doing it just to be obnoxious. We're doing it because it is Judea, because we are the Jews from Judea, and that was what it was biblically. And much of our history, of our ancient history, lies in that area, in Shiloh, right, or Shiloh, where our first altar stood, and where, you know, much of our stories happened was in the West Bank. Hebron, right? Hebron, the city of Hebron, is second holiest site to Jews. It's where we believe Abraham went and bought land and buried, and he himself was buried there along with his wife and their children and their grandchildren. And that's important. And we should never stop talking about it, because regardless of what happens, it will always be important to us. But one thing that I think we also need to acknowledge is that this land has also become important to the Palestinians. And it isn't just about having a state for them, the same way that for us it wasn't just about having a state anywhere, it was about having a state in our land. And they feel the same way. They want a state in what they believe is their land. And they feel very connected to that land. And to diminish that, or to say, well, they could just move into Jordan. The same way, well, as a Jew, would you be okay if I just said, well, you could just move to Uganda? No, we wouldn't. Right. The same way that they are not. And I think that needs to be said, because, you know, we want people to respect how we say it and what we say about this being our land and us feeling connected to it. And I think we need to give the same acknowledgement to Palestinians, who also, after generations, feel very connected to this land. And they don't want to live anywhere else. And many of them want independence in their land. And some might say to me, no, they don't, Charlotte. They would happily live in a Jewish state. And I think that's anecdotal evidence. And I think there are some Palestinians today who would say, I would be fine living in a Jewish state. But I don't think they mean forever. I think some of them would say, today, I don't like the Palestinian Authority. I think they're corrupt and not helpful. And I think if I had to choose between them or Israel, I would choose Israel. But that doesn't mean that that's what they want permanently. Right. I think there's a follow-up question that needs to be asked there that many don't ask because they don't want to know the answer to it. And so I think we need to, the two of us and the Jewish people, you know, there's a lot of similarities here between us and the Palestinians. And I think actually the craziest thing is that, you know, we're fighting over something, which is this land, when really if we push past all of the ideology and the hatred and the conflict, the simple fact is that we both care so much about the same piece of land. Isn't that something that could, rather than divide us, unite us and help us solve our differences? Just a thought.
To stay up to date with JTV content, click subscribe here if you're on YouTube and hit the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, hit the like button, and under following, click see first. If you enjoy watching JTV content and want to help us continue to grow, please consider making a donation to us by clicking here.
We're live. Welcome, friends from around the world. I'm in the middle of a little kombucha explosion. That's how we're going to start this episode. I was going to say I wanted this episode to be sponsored by Hatha Kombucha, an awesome kombucha company here in Israel. They didn't give me any money, but I like their product, so I was going to shout them out, but then they exploded everywhere. This is Kiwi Lime Kombucha. You can find them on Instagram. It seems to be the yellow kiwi. That's new and it's in. And for those who don't know what kombucha is, it's fermented tea. It's high in probiotics, supposedly healthy. But why the hell are we talking about kombucha? This is The Great Debate. We're here to have a vibrant conversation. Welcome, everybody. For those who are here for the first time, what is The Great Debate? It's not a debate where two sides work to defeat one another. That's not what we're here to do. Muhammad and Daniel are not going to fight. They may disagree, but the goal of The Great Debate is to come together and find common ground on the most important issues we face. That's what makes this debate great. We're looking for a deep, nuanced conversation on important issues. And that's what you'll see here. So welcome, everybody. Without further ado, I'm very excited to announce our guests. On my bottom left, we have Daniel Brooks, who is the founder and current board member of 3GNY, a nonprofit organization from the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, whose mission is to educate the public on their family stories and lessons of the Holocaust. As an Israel advocate, he has organized demonstrations spoken on panels, and written op-eds in the Times of Israel. Daniel is currently Associate Director of Fuel for Truth and an educator with Club Z, both nonprofit organizations dedicated to Israel education. On my bottom right, Mohammed Faraj is a Palestinian American that has lived both in Palestine and New York. He is currently a graduate student at Brooklyn College for bilingual childhood education. He dedicates his free time discussing various topics, including the Palestine-Israeli conflict and advocating for human solutions to the conflict. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure.
So, you know, it's interesting. The guests generally send in their bio. Sorry, I still have this exploded kombucha here. I'm trying to take a sip. But Mohammed, you sent in your bio to me, and it says Palestine-Israel conflict, and I've never called it that before. I just read it off as Palestine and Israel conflict, and it was super counterintuitive because my whole life I've known it as the Israel-Palestine conflict. So it's interesting how which side of the border you were born on or what your side is. It's kind of how you frame the conflict. So it's an interesting observation that I just experienced firsthand. Before we get started on the topics, I'd like to just give you both a few minutes to explain what your connection to the land of Israel and Palestine is. Whoever wants to start, the floor is yours.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Great, thanks, Mohammed. I grew up in New York City. I'm Jewish. Not Israeli. Grew up the grandson of 4 Holocaust survivors, and as you mentioned, Adar, I founded that organization 15 years ago, third generation New York. Growing up, the connections I felt to Israel were primarily a couple things. It was my Israeli cousins who'd sometimes visit New York. I have aunts, uncles, other cousins who are Israeli, who live in Israel. A few of them actually just made Aliyah. And my mother, who was a marketing executive for an Israeli bank, Bank of Pauline, in New York, when I was growing up. So I was actually ensconced in like Israel marketing materials here and there. So I did get this generic kind of pro-Israel understanding without really fully knowing what it was. I first visited Israel on an organized trip in 1993. This was before birthright, so the parents had to pay up. I've been there 4 times since. And as I mentioned, I grew up sort of understanding Israel in a generic sense, but it was really in 2001, during the second Intifada, that I committed to educating myself more. I remember just reading coverage of what was going on, the bombings, Israel's military responses, and I recall feeling that it was unfair, and without really knowing exactly why. There might have been some moments where I was like, oh, I know that to be not true, but I was embarrassed that I didn't really know why, yet I felt it was unfair. And so I was like, that's not acceptable. I really have to learn the issue. Otherwise, why am I getting invested in this topic? So I just committed myself, that was almost 20 years ago, to knowing history, knowing people as best I can. I don't speak to many Palestinians. In fact, it's pretty rare. So I'm really humbled to be here talking to Mohammed. And I just committed myself to knowing more about the issue, knowing more about the history, defending the truth, pushing back against the hate, and ultimately creating productive channels for conversation and resolution. So thanks again for having me.
Awesome. Great to have you, Daniel. Mohammed, welcome.
Thank you. So my connection to the land basically started with the fact I was born there. I was born in Jerusalem, but moved to New York. Me and my parents moved to New York when I was super young, before I became a year old. And I stayed there until I went to a Islamic school here in New York until I was in 3rd grade. And then they were worried that I was gonna get too Americanized and kind of forget about the culture and stuff. So they brought me back to Palestine, to Ramallah specifically, where I lived until my senior year of high school. I graduated my high school over there and moved back to New York. And now I go back almost every summer, except for this summer, obviously. But I go back every summer for about a month or a month and a half at a time to go visit. And so, for the most part, similarly, I grew up in a pretty pro-Palestinian generic household, but it wasn't my parents weren't really that political, but I still had, we were still taught in school, being very patriotic and stuff. And at that point, I've never met, the only Israelis I've ever met were soldiers or settlers that you'd see when going on a highway from one city to the other. And so I didn't really have any opinion of, I just knew that Israel bad, and that was about it. And when I moved to New York, and especially Brooklyn and Queens, I can imagine it's very diverse. You meet a whole bunch of different people. In undergrad, you get to meet more people and stuff. Since then, I began to try to my best to look at the whole situation from a third-person perspective and try to be more objective when analyzing what's happening and trying to look at it from more of a humanitarian issue as opposed to an ethnic conflict. So since then, I've been trying to my opinions change pretty frequently depending on what we're specifically talking about at the moment. But I'm just always hoping to learn and engage more with people that have different opinions so I can formulate a better opinion myself.
Awesome. It's great to have you here too, Mohammed. So before we get started, I just wanted to mention that to all our guests from around the world, welcome. Maybe let us know in the chat where you're from, and let's engage in a vibrant dialogue in the chat as well. Also, feel free to ask questions. We will get to the questions towards the end. And if you like what our guests are saying, you can find their contact information in the event description. Feel free to reach out to them. They're always happy to engage in dialogue after the fact. We also have a little after party in our Discord server. For those who are unfamiliar with Discord, it's just another messaging app, really, for gamers. So we have a private chat there that's for Patreon members and for guest speakers. If you haven't already, check out the Patreon. It's link in the description. You can unlock all sorts of cool benefits and tiers by supporting this channel on Patreon. And even if you don't want to support Patreon, that's fine. Give us an upvote on this video, subscribe, or even downvote if you don't like it. We're cool with that too. Just express yourself. That's what we want. We just want expression. So, Mo, you in our Discord chat earlier, you brought up an interesting point about Zionism, and I think this is a good place to start the conversation. You want to share what
the fact of how Zionism changed in the modern context, as opposed to how it started in the minds of Menachem Weizmann and Theodor Herzl and that sort of thing, and how it basically gradually shifted from being a more secular movement to a religious movement as it is in its current manifestation. And so I was curious to see what you guys, either of you, like thought about that, and like if we've reached similar analytical conclusions on on this sort of shift.
Sure. Yeah, Daniel, you wanna start?
Sure. So at its heart, Zionism, always political Zionism, the movement to establish, has been the movement to establish and maintain a Jewish state in the land of Israel, or at least in a part of the land of Israel. And while there have been some movements towards religious Zionism in the last several decades, I mean, ultimately that's still how most Jews and most Zionism in the last several decades, I mean, ultimately that's still how most Jews and most Zionists define Zionism. That's still effectively what Israel is. Israel is still a collective. It's a Jewish collective. So, we might have policies that may be influenced by those on the right, those on the religious right in Israel, more so now than perhaps before. But ultimately, it's still that same basic definition, which I think also, we'll get to this, but I think it's still the heart of the conflict, which is just, denying that right for a Jewish collective, you could say, or Jewish society, to put it a little more succinctly.
Yeah, well said. And just to build on that, it's true that in its initial days, Zionism was secular, but that's because it was, still quite a small movement. Now, it's not that it's become religious, it's that there is also religious Zionism. So, if you, around 50% of the Jews living in Israel are observant Jews, the other 50% are secular. And, there's a spectrum of what it means to be observant or secular, but regardless of who you ask, the secular or observant, the majority of them would identify as Zionists. So it's not that Zionism has moved from being secular to religious, it's now also religious. And I think that the religious Zionism might cause more waves because it's generally, we hear about the settlers and their ideology, and there's a lot of focus on religious Zionism because they're essentially more directly connected to the conflict because of where they're living. So I think maybe that's why there's a perception that religious Zionism is the Zionism today. I just think it's most Jews are Zionists, some are secular, some are Israeli. Something to add to that, I think the term Zionism also creates a lot of confusion, because if you ask somebody who's pro-Israel what Zionism means, they'd say it's just the right to self-determination on our ancestral homeland. That's essentially what it is, with some small variations. But if you ask somebody who opposes Israel what Zionism is, they would tell you it's akin to Jewish supremacy. It's people who hate Palestinians and commit genocide. And what I'm going to tell people who have this version of Zionism, if you have any interest in engaging in dialogue with Israelis, then you should use the definition that they use, because this is their own personal identity. And if you want to be able to communicate with them, you should, you shouldn't take what they view as an essential part of their identity and turn it into something that's as horrible as supremacy or even Nazism, which it's often compared to. So that's just a little pointer for how to have better dialogue between pro and anti-Israel people. It's to agree on what Zionism means.
Before I get to what
Sure.
I just wanted to add briefly to that. I mean, I think just because it doesn't help that not really understood, and people don't really know what it connects to. And obviously it connects to the land, but at its, at origin, Zion referred to, a hill in Jerusalem, a fortress. And I think, my Jewish education growing up did not provide that knowledge to me. So, if you would have asked me when I was a young adult, my 20s, what's Zionism? I could have told you very basically, but if you said, well, what does it mean? Like, the etymology of it, I couldn't tell you. And so I think that's also a barrier to understanding it. It just seems like an odd term. And anytime you have an ism there, I think it has a negative connotation.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because do we even need the term Zionism? Can't we just say that, we're Jewish and we believe we have the right to homeland? Like what?
That's what I was gonna say. I feel like it's very difficult. I don't even think it's very difficult. I think it's downright impossible to ever convince most Palestinians that Zionism is somehow anyway could be translated into a good thing. And that's just literally, that's from my experience. I've been surrounded by Palestinians my whole life. And for the most part, I just think that's what it is. And the thing is with really what the sticking point about Zionism that's really upsetting for Palestinians and for a lot of people around the world is that it excludes half the population of the land as part of being that state by creating a quote unquote Jewish state or a homeland for Jews. It basically excludes half the population, basically tells Arab Israelis or Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza that you guys, this is not a state for you guys, this is a state for only us. And so that's really the thing that, and it most likely stems from the fact that Zionism came from a past where nationalism was on the rise and where like a lot of like colonialization was happening. And so like I can see like how that originated, but I just feel like moving forward, it probably needs to change for the most part. Yeah.
There's something I wrote down that you said that's just grabbing me, and it's so basic. It's the idea, the framing of in the land, where you were saying that Palestinians see it, Zionism as you know, a state for just us guys and not for us in the land, or you might have said in the whole land. But you know, it's understood that Palestinians see the whole land as theirs, or at least to a large extent. And I think, you know, a lot of Zionists don't see it that way. I mean, they might conversely see Israel as the entirety of the land, but you know, the way I see it is there is a division, and to me, there's nothing completely politically sacred about between river and the, you know, the land between the river and the sea. And you know, some Zionists, and I think rightly so, have pointed out that, you know, the exact borders of river to the sea Palestine was actually a very brief period of history, you know, for a couple decades under the British Mandate. Not to say that Palestinians weren't living, or Arabs, you know, of that origin weren't living in different parts, but there was also the East Bank of the Jordan, and that was considered historic Palestine as well, by various people. So I just, you know, it's an interesting framework to talk about, you know, in the land, quote unquote, because different people have different interpretations of what that means.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. So what do you think, you know, needs to be done? What can we do to move forward, right? We're obviously having this conversation, but Mohammed, as you mentioned, you know, most Palestinians will not accept the term Zionism, and I'm sure many cringe even at the term Israel, because I know from firsthand experience that me just saying the word Palestine is triggering to many Israelis, right? So this is the result of a century of conflict and a lot of trauma, a lot of pain and trauma, which causes, you know, many of our people to be triggered by these terms. So what can we do to make maybe even not necessarily these terms more acceptable, but just being able to bring both people together towards common ground? What do you see as good first steps to making that happen?
I would say, like, from my perspective, I feel since the Israeli government has the upper hand and pretty much has most control of all the situation that's going on in the West Bank and inside 48 or Israel. I feel like it's their duty and almost obligation, since really, like, everything that Palestinians do is at the mercy of Israel. We can't drive from city to city without going through checkpoints, so we can't really, we're really, at the end of the day, like, the PA is just basically a puppet government controlled with various levels of influence from Israel. And that's the reason why we're allowed to have this level of minor autonomy. But I think for the biggest thing is that the Israeli government needs to make a concerted effort to try to bring Palestinians into the fold and say that this country belongs to you, and we understand that the mistake that we did in the past, like, for example, like America, like right now you see America is going through this sort of reawakening of saying that, oh, the founding of the Americas wasn't as glorious as it seemed. There's a lot of indigenous people that got killed throughout the process. There was slavery involved. There was a lot of this abuse of minority groups. And then after that, America has came to the great, for better or worse, most Americans have come to the realization that what happened in the past is a mistake. And that's why we have these movements and these laws that are enacted to acknowledge the past of America. I feel like Israel needs to do the exact same thing, that regardless, like we know the way that the state was created had a lot of immorality in it and a lot of suffering and a lot of pain. But we are here now, and we got to find a way to look forward and try to put ourselves in a situation where we live peacefully with our neighbors and see each other as brethren as opposed to enemies.
So you're under the opinion that because Israel has most of the power, that the onus is really on us to do most of the work in reconciliation?
Yeah, I feel, yeah, I do that. It's not that Palestinians just got to sit there and like just wait until like Israel comes and apologizes to them. It's just that the way that, like, this probably goes into our conversation about the power dynamics is that Israel, for the most part, has all the leverage in this situation. Like as you saw, like they basically made the peace deal with Bahrain and what was the other? Oh, yeah, the UAE, about, like, you know, normalizing between Arabs and Jews. And the thing was that it's like they completely like forgot about like Palestinians. This whole like problem and all this conflict between the Arab world and Israel came from is from the Palestinians. Is that like the Palestinians were the ones that were undergoing through the trauma. The UAE and Bahrain have never been engaged in any like direct physical conflict with Israel. Maybe like during the oil years where they like all the Gulf countries like cut oil to the U.S. that had like some effect, but for the most part they were like relatively like peaceful already. This just seems like nonsense to me, that and avoiding of like the real problem of how do we address the problems that Palestinians face and how can we fix that.
Okay, Daniel, where do you stand on the issue of and this kind of goes into a topic that you proposed about power dynamics, right? So where do you stand on that? Who's the onus on? How do we reconcile? What's the way forward?
Sure, a lot to unpack there, but I'll start with the power dynamics. I do think it is a very unfortunate myth that because Israel holds greater military and greater economic power over the Palestinians, that the onus is on them to solve this conflict. A few reasons. One, Israelis have had 25 years of making concerted, very publicized efforts of solving the conflict. Now, we can disagree on the specifics of those efforts. At the same time, these have been very public, and Israelis have elected 2 prime ministers who ran on specific peace platforms. So it's very much on record that Israelis tried this and it backfired. And I know it's it's kind of inconvenient to talk about the PA's activities for the last 25 years, but we don't have to go through a whole timeline. But when the PA was created, they wasted no time to use all their media to incite against Israel and essentially to tell their people that Oslo was a ruse. And we could play around with the timeline and say, well, settlements increased, or maybe the Israeli military did X, Y, Z. But there's really nothing that trumps, the so-called peace partner of the Palestinian Authority, broadcasting very clearly that they have no intention of ever recognizing Israel or a two-state solution. So that's one thing. But I want to talk about the power because I'm just curious. What do you think, Mohammed, that the Palestinian society has any power, and if so, what levers of power do they have?
They probably have soft power and like influence in trying to influence each other, but in terms of economics or the basic things that are needed to sustain human life, such as electricity, water, agriculture, that's almost all controlled by Israel. And so that's what leads me to like put most of the onus on the Israeli government, since they do have almost most of the cards in their hand. And yeah, go ahead.
I would say that specifically the Palestinians have 2 types of power that are often overlooked: diplomatic power and media power. I think media power may be bigger.
Media power? They have media power? Where?
Diplomatic, but I think they work hand in hand. Now we could argue that maybe the diplomatic power took a hit for this, the latest UAE deal, Bahrain. I would say that whole, the way you said they were left out, they were completely forgotten about, which, not entirely. I mean, I don't want to get into all the specifics of this Trump deal, but they were invited. But even before that, in 2014, the PA explicitly said we will never again directly negotiate with Israel, and so that's very relevant. I mean, it didn't even need to hear that announcement. But they, for decades, are telegraphing that they are going to try to hold out politically and not sign any agreement with Israel. So I get that Israel has power on the ground, but the reason that the military occupation of certain parts of the West Bank have perpetuated is because they can't hand over this land and this infrastructure to moderate Palestinians such as yourself, right? They need a political entity. And I think that's often overlooked, that we are dealing with people, but really at the end of the day, what affects people? It's their leadership, right? It's politics, it's power. So, I mean, I have heard from Palestinians who are moderate and want to make peace with Israel. And when I was in Israel, I spoke to several, and I was heartwarmed. At the same time, I realized that there needs to be, and this is where this is where the responsibility comes in. Because you were saying that, you were kind of tying this to the civil rights movement now, this big moment. And actually, I agree to a large extent. But I think I see it the other way. Israel's already had these conversations about their origins, some of the things that happened in the 48 war, right? The racism that goes on in Israeli society, like it does in any society. And not to say that those conversations should be over. I mean, they're always ongoing. But I don't think there's been any equivalent conversation in Palestinian society. I think it's actually shockingly mute. I think that people are intimidated from engaging on these issues, as we've seen evidence of people who want to engage with Israel and they're intimidated. So I think that's a real problem. And I think that it's not going to be overnight, but ultimately the Palestinians have to start a dialogue, an internal dialogue. From what I've seen, that hasn't happened. And I think that, we're reconciling our past as Americans. I think Israelis have already done that to a large extent. You've had the new historians. You've had, Israeli media, as you know, is very tenacious. These conversations are always going on. I think Palestinians have a lot of people who do want to have these conversations, and they're literary. I think they're in the media. They have a lot of media channels, and this needs to happen because that's going to be what drives the politics. That conversation. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, the conversation that Palestinians need to have.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last part again?
I'd like to hear your thoughts on the need for Palestinians as a collective to have this conversation, meaning what do they want? What do we want as a collective? And do we need to defeat the radicals and extremists in our midst?
Right.
Yeah,
go ahead, Adar.
Before you go, Daniel, I think it's great points. I'd love to hear. I want to make a quick comment. Chat. Take a deep breath. It's okay. Learn from Daniel and Muhammad what productive dialogue is all about. There's no reason to be hating one another. Just know that you will never convince an Israeli, or an Israeli will never convince a Palestinian to change their mind if you're acting hateful towards them, and if you're delegitimizing them and not even recognizing the right to exist. So again, breathe. We could do better, guys.
All right, I can't do this. I can't.
I just wanted, this is an issue that's really important to me, the Israel and Palestinian conflict, and I kind of wanted to call in and clarify a few things. I called in on Monday with Matt and Michael, so I just wanted to sort of weigh in from my side. I think one of the major problems in not just this one 2 years ago and just ongoing for decades is that everyone is so reactionary to what happens and they don't pay attention to what is really important. There's demonstrations, for example, for the Gaza people who are basically the major victims in all this, taking casualties, right? And no one's talking about what's actually happening, how to help those people. Why isn't the international community going in there and helping the Israelis to get rid of Hamas? Why aren't they, offering to fill the void after Hamas is gone to nation build and not create anarchy like there was before Hamas?
Well, no, but I mean, I think, I don't know under what authority, frankly, the UN would have to go in and help Israel get rid of Hamas. I mean, at one point Hamas was elected, was popularly elected. So, I mean, it may be the case that Hamas is not a positive force in this conflict, but I think it's also arguable as to whether or not the Israelis are either, in terms of getting peace. And so I'm not sure I even understand the basis of that assessment.
So let me clarify. Even if the Israelis, which I totally take your point, I mean, I'm not a fan of Netanyahu's actions. And I think that there were many prime ministers before him who got much closer to a peace agreement than he ever did. Having said that, Hamas is really, there will be no peace as long as Hamas is in power.
Look, all I can tell you is a month and a half ago, Hamas had basically capitulated to all of Abbas's demands, had joined the unity government under those auspices, and the Palestinians were prepared to go forward.
Yeah, this whole Palestinian unity thing is a sham, basically. 2 years ago, they attempted a reconciliation in a similar way. Look, if Hamas is really part of this unity government, and this unity government has negotiated a ceasefire with Israel, brokered by Egypt, why isn't Hamas honoring what they're supposedly part of the government?
Wait a second. First of all, what truce that was brokered? What truce that was brokered? What are you talking about? The one that Egypt came up with, and that the Israelis accepted a couple of days ago, and then it was supposed to start at at 3 p.m. and prior to that, Israel started bombing again?
Well, Hamas never agreed to that ceasefire, and the reason they don't agree, and they make it very clear, even now, they say they will not agree. I mean, Kerry is now trying to make a ceasefire.
Right, they won't agree until the blockade is removed.
Correct. Right. They want to get rid of the blockade. The blockade, by the way, I just want to clarify, the blockade is done by Egypt and Israel, and the Israeli side is actually more lenient because the Israeli side is actually, since 2010, letting through materials and all kinds of things, except those things that can be used to make rockets. The
And
Egypt
food.
side only lets through people and not any supplies.
Food and medicine.
Right, humanitarian stuff for sure, civilian stuff for sure, but not things that can be used to make rockets. What I'm trying to say is no one is talking about putting our country's boots on the ground in that region, which is a small region. It's not like Iraq. We have borders where
George, I don't
understand.
Okay, I don't understand. Greg, I'm not following here what you're suggesting. You're suggesting that the UN and the international community should go in and take out Hamas, whatever that means.
In a nutshell, I'm saying in a nutshell that they stop at blaming Israel. It's easy to blame Israel and do nothing. They do nothing. Our countries do absolutely nothing to help the Gaza people. They could help. It's a small piece of land.
We could help by putting in funds. We could help by saying no blockade.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
We could help by saying no blockade. We could help by saying no blockade. We could help by pouring funds into to Gaza. We could also help by saying to Israel, hey, you know what? You know that whole thing about the settlements, which you agreed explicitly to stop increasing them in the West Bank? That destabilizes any attempts of moderates within the Palestinian people. We're going to tie our funding to you to actually holding to, what was it, the 2009 agreement? I mean, look, Israel has agreed to stop settlements, and Israel has never done it. That's a fact.
In the West Bank, I agree with you. But
yes, but it doesn't matter. You can't listen. It begins to undercut the authority of moderates, because they make a deal, and then Israel doesn't seem to subject themselves to any of the terms.
When you say Israel, by the way, there's a whole Israeli left, which you never talk about on the show.
Well, I understand. Of course I talk about the Israeli left. But you want to look at the polling right now in Israel? You know who the next? You know who's the odds-on favorite right now to maybe be the next leader of Israel?
Listen, I agree with you. It's turned to the right. But what I'm trying to say is, if you care about the Gaza people, the people that are actually being killed, okay, our countries only stop at calling on Israel to lift the blockade. They don't even call on Egypt to lift the blockade.
You know what? If you really want the number one way to protect Gazan civilians right now would be for the Israelis to stop firing missiles upon them. There is...
Okay, and then what happens after that for the next year? How does the rule of Hamas help the Gazans exactly?
Well,
Hamas kills them.
That's a separate question, isn't it? That's a separate question. The way that you disempower Hamas was exactly what was done 2.5 months ago, which was an extended period of truce. Now, you're going to have to get back to that place, but Israel's not interested in getting to that place. They have proven
you understand, during this truce, Hamas was building tunnels in order to invade Israel.
You know what?
Tunnels,
listen,
right?
if you want to stop Hamas from invading Israel, then you bring Israeli soldiers down to that border and you station them there. And yes, it may cause more Israeli casualties, but if you want to stop killing, if you want Palestinian civilians to stop dying, there is one thing you can do in the short term to actually make that happen. That is, stop firing missiles into Gaza.
Okay, and continue to receive rockets, hundreds of rockets a day.
We know that those rockets are ineffective because of Iron Dome. So much so that Mayor Bloomberg was there on TV saying, it's perfectly safe here.
Okay, so listen, I have just one question for you.
Yeah.
Okay, my question is, do you realize how much Hamas has hurt the Gaza people?
Yes.
Forget Israel.
Yes.
Forget Israel.
Yes.
Take Israel out of the
Yes.
equation.
Yes.
Okay,
yes, I do. Now, do you realize that this attack by Israel has strengthened Hamas? Do you realize that? Do you realize that Hamas today is more powerful? Hamas today is more powerful than they were 5 weeks ago. Do you realize that?
They're more powerful today.
Yes, they are more powerful today than they were 5 weeks ago. There is not one analyst that you can read or you can read. There is not one analyst who would disagree with that statement.
The European Union is currently, in an unprecedented move, is calling for the removal of Hamas, or at least the disarmament of Hamas.
Amongst the Palestinian people, Hamas is far more powerful Their political situation has improved dramatically because of this. That is indisputable.
Listen, ISIS is powerful. Does that mean we're supposed to let them do whatever they want?
Well, you know what?
They're killing the Gazans.
No, they're not killing the Gazans. The Israelis are killing the Gazans.
Listen to me. Here's a fact. Before the Israelis ever put up the blockade, okay, here's a fact. When Hamas was democratically elected into the Palestinian Legislative Council, it immediately said it will not honor any previous agreements after a one-year truce. It will not recognize Israel, and it will not renounce violence.
You're completely missing my point.
Right.
Okay, what you're arguing is, I'm saying to you that when I take this pen and I drop it, it lands on the floor. And you're saying, but that pen is bad. And I'm saying, I don't give I understand. I'm not a fan of Hamas.
That's not what
I'm not supporting Hamas. I am simply saying there is a physics to this. And it is not subject to your opinion of whether or not Hamas is a good force or a bad force.
Okay, just assume,
the reality is this has
on,
empowered Hamas. That's just the reality.
Let's assume. Fine. But let's assume that Israel does what you say it will do. The Gaza people will still live under the rule of Hamas. Can I just say one?
Let me tell you something. 3 months ago, they were looking like they would not be.
Yeah, it always looks like that.
All right.
Hamas
Well,
has
okay.
disarmed everyone
All right.
in Gaza.
All right.
They have a monopoly on the
All right,
arms
George.
in Gaza. Who is going to vote them out? Who? How will they get voted out?
Are you aware that a month and a half ago they did a unity accord, and they had basically agreed to every term that Abbas had offered? I mean, I keep asking you this question. You seem to ignore the reality of it. So I don't know. You tell me, George. What should we be doing? Should we send down troops? Should we keep bombing Palestinians? What should we do?
The international community.
Okay, the international community should do what? We should invade Gaza?
Should help liberate Gaza. From
Okay,
Hamas,
how would we do
and
that?
then help
Give me
them
the
to build a
specifics.
moderate government.
Give me the specifics. Israel is dropping 1,500 missiles on them.
The same exact way that we did it in Iraq for worse
Oh,
reasons.
okay.
And in Iraq,
I see.
yes,
All
but
right.
in Iraq, there
That's
was
an
one
interesting. Okay. All right. So you're saying that what
Okay,
we should
in
do is
Iraq,
the same
we
thing we
went in
did in
the 80s.
Iraq.
Well, let me just say one thing. In the 80s, we went into the Gulf War, and this is, Michael, this is where I think you misunderstood on Monday when I said we withdrew. I meant we withdrew in the 80s when we defeated the Republican Guard.
Talking about 1991.
You're talking about the 1991, but we didn't go into Baghdad.
right.
I mean, you're talking about invading, shock and awe. Okay, we started with shock and awe, if I remember correctly, with Baghdad. And you're talking about dropping off these type of ordinances. Where will the Palestinian people go? I mean, how many civilians do you anticipate we should kill? That will be killed there.
I'm not saying we should kill them.
No, but they're
I'm
going to
saying
die.
that if
There's no doubt about it. By definition, they're going to die. I mean, we know that 70% of the.
They're going to die either way, unfortunately.
Okay. Well,
There's no
I
way to
mean,
stop the death.
you know what, George? I just don't think I'm not in a
Saddam
position
got
to advocate that much civilian death. I mean, we know at this point that 70% of the deaths that have taken place in Gaza have been civilians. So you're willing to say, like, you know what? For the good of the Palestinian people, I'm going to advocate for the deaths of tens of thousands of them?
No.
How many?
What I'm saying
5,000?
is much more peaceful. Well,
No,
let me
George.
answer you.
There is no.
I'm saying that for the last.
All right, I got to jump, George.
For the last
We've
7
talked
years,
about this.
Hamas had a peaceful way to help. Okay, next time I'll tell you. Hamas could have just renounced violence, and the other countries would have.
That's right.
Actually
That's right.
worked
And
with them.
Bibi
But they never
Netanyahu
do it
could have
because
just said no settlements, and I love the Palestinians, and we're all going to be friends. But none of that is happening. So we are left with the reality,
Let me just
George.
ask one final question before. Can I just ask one final question on this call? Okay. My question is, after the Israeli army completely withdrew to the 1967 borders, the Gaza people have that land. They have the borders. All they have to do is not fire rockets, and all they have to do is basically work with the international community. That's it. Why can't they do that? Because Hamas is in power, and because Hamas.
That's not a question,
needs to be
George.
the go-to.
All right, I'm going to say goodbye. That's not a question. That was a statement. And it doesn't matter if what your statement is accurate. It doesn't matter. Because I'm talking about the reality now. And yes, if we go back to 1945, and the British did not control that area, and did not determine that they're going to give up part of that land to the Jews, and if the Jews had not kicked out the Palestinians in certain areas, and if we go prior to that, if there was no Holocaust, and if we go prior to that, if there was no World War I, and if we go prior to that, yes, all of those things may be the case. But the reality is there was a reality on the ground 2 months ago. And the reality is we cannot wave a wand and make Hamas better. And the other reality is that those teenagers were probably kidnapped by a group that was not even based in Gaza, that Hamas could not control. These are fantastical things that are really based upon some type of subjective perception of the moral quality of these actors. And I'll tell you something. When you start to talk about the moral quality of some of these players, I don't think there's any way to get to some type of sustainable peace. I really don't think there is. I mean, the reality is you have hundreds of Palestinian civilians at this point killed. If you want them not to be killed, the first thing you do is stop dropping bombs on them. And yes, I understand. There are rockets being fired at Israel. They have figured out a way to protect themselves. Right? I mean, we know this because there have been 2 civilian deaths, and that was down through the tunnels. And you can put Israeli soldiers down there, and they could fight those incursions. Yes, I understand there is a tendency to say, okay, there is domestic pressure. You've got to go in and punish those Palestinians. I understand that. And maybe it is far-fetched to assume that Israel would not go in or could withstand the domestic pressure. But the reality is, if you want those civilians to stop dying, you have to stop dropping bombs on them. It is that simple.
Well, and just, again, also, he talks about Hamas as this one-dimensional actor, and there has been long stretches of time where Hamas has restrained rocket fire from Gaza. And you talk about if you just want to go in and punish the population of Gaza, that's what's happening. That's what part of this is. What do you think they mean when they call operations like this lawn mowing?
That's exactly.
I mean,
right.
I don't like it. You got to be really delusional to not see the upshot of what this is. And of course, I mean, as soon as they withdrew, they still had Gaza under blockade and under effective control. So even the notion to say that Gaza was just liberated is ludicrous. There was never autonomy in Gaza,
right.
period. And then they elected Hamas, and then they were punished as a result of it. Right. I mean, and then also, like, you talk about the Saddam Hussein analogy and being bad to you. Saddam Hussein probably does have had a body count of like over 1 million of his own people, including gassing Kurds. And our invasion was still tremendously stupid and destructive.
Right.
And a failure.
Here is Bernie Sanders, again, this time on the Final Five with Anderson Cooper, which I found very confusing. To say Final Five during March Madness is weird to me. But maybe that's what they were trying to do, some type of tie-in. But here is Bernie Sanders talking about, about Israel, because yesterday was a big Israel day.
You've said that the U.S. should be even-handed when it comes to dealing with the Israelis and the Palestinians. So does that mean that the U.S. should remain neutral to achieve peace?
No, what it means is that if we want lasting peace in the Middle East. We have got to obviously make sure that the security and the independence of Israel remains intact. That is not a debate. Israel must continue to exist as an independent, free state. But if we are going to have lasting peace, we have also got to work with the Palestinians. And what that means, we have got to recognize that for example, in Gaza, you got an unemployment rate of 44%. You have people living in horrific poverty. You have a community that was destroyed. So if we are going to go forward, it cannot be that the United States just takes the side of Israel. We've got to work with both communities to try to do what is very, very difficult, and that is create a lasting peace in the region.
Do you think the U.S. has not been even-handed up till now?
Right, I do not think so. I think that overwhelmingly the United States time and time again has looked aside when Israel has done some bad things. I think, for example, that the growth of settlements in Palestinian territory is not acceptable to me and not conducive to the peace process. I think that the kind of destruction that was wreaked on Gaza during that war was way above what needed to be done for military purposes. A lot of civilians were killed. A lot of hospitals and schools and apartments were destroyed above and beyond what had to be done. So look, I think there is no question that there's enough blame to go around on both sides. Israel has the right to defend itself against terrorist attacks, against Hezbollah, against Hamas. But I think the United States is stronger when we work with both sides.
What's fascinating to me about this is taking him this long to say this. I mean, this is a very, very strong statement. I think this is certainly by far the most, I don't know how to characterize this. I don't want to say left, but yeah, I mean left of center anyway statement that we've ever heard by a major candidate in a primary who was, in March still mathematically could potentially be the nominee of the Democratic Party. I mean, the statement is late, but it is certainly welcome. And I can only imagine, I don't know what the calculation of this is. I don't know if it's frankly because maybe Donald Trump opened up some oxygen to the left of Hillary on this, frankly. I don't know. Maybe it's because Sanders feels that in the states going forward, he will not be punished for being this frank about it. But this is an impressive statement. It's a very important one. And look, this is a guy who's heading into to do or die time in terms of these primaries, and he does not perceive that as being a political liability because he did not shy away from this. I mean, he hit all the points. It's pretty impressive. Hi, I'm Sam Cedar, and this is an Ann Coulter doll.
You should not be immigrating here. Yeah. Stay in your country and hate us.
For smart progressive talk and a little bit of this and even a little bit of that.
Mission accomplished.
Subscribe to our podcast, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and like us on Facebook to get some of our best video clips. One of the tricky things I think about, particularly being a new candidate is, for someone like AOC, one of the tricky things, but also one of the amazing things is that she has been able to withstand, and the last time I think we talked about this was after she won on CNN, they were really attempting to trip her up, and she's very savvy and knows her stuff and didn't. In this instance, she went on to Firing Line with Margaret Hoover. Is this like theoretically the same show as
I think so, yeah.
Wow, that's weird. And the AOC on some level, like, she gets it right, but I think she just wasn't sure if she just, I think, had either a slight brain fart or was just not quite
maybe unsure if she was out ahead of her skis a little
Yes, exactly. So I don't know. The people have been talking about this, but I don't think it's quite as bad as it was, although she is supposedly backtracked a little bit from this, which is, I think, problematic. But here is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on with Firing Line host Margaret Hoover.
Tweet or made one statement that referred to a killing by Israeli soldiers of civilians in Gaza and called it a massacre, which became a little bit controversial. But I haven't seen anywhere. What is your position on Israel?
Well, I believe absolutely in Israel's right to exist. I am a proponent of a two-state solution. And for me, this is not a referendum, I think, on the state of Israel. For me, the lens through which I saw this incident as an activist, as an organizer, if 60 people were killed in Ferguson, Missouri, if 60 people were killed in the South Bronx, unarmed, 60 people were killed in Puerto Rico, I just looked at that incident more through just as an incident. And to me, it would just be completely unacceptable if that happened on our shores. But I am...
Of course, the dynamic there in terms of geopolitics and the war in the Middle East is very different than people expressing their First Amendment right to protest.
Well, yes, but I also think that what people are starting to see, at least in the occupation of Palestine, is just an increasing crisis of humanitarian condition. And that, to me, is just where I tend to come from on this issue.
You use the term the occupation of Palestine. What did you mean by that?
I think what I meant is like the settlements that are increasing in some of these areas and places where Palestinians are experiencing difficulty in access to their housing and homes.
Do you think you can expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd also just, I am not the expert on geopolitics on this issue. You know, for me, I'm a firm believer in finding a two-state solution in this issue. And I'm happy to sit down with leaders on both of these. For me, I just look at things through a human rights lens. And I may not use the right words. I know this is
That's very honest. That's very honest, and you're going.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the thing that she could be faulted on is just having not sufficient confidence in what she's talking about. The only thing that's even remotely controversial, and by controversial I mean even in dispute, because the idea that there's an occupation is not disputed by anybody. They are called the occupied territories. That is not a term of activists. That is a term by the UN. That is a term by the U.S. government. The only thing that would be technically even slightly controversial is the idea of Palestine, because they do not have sovereignty over their borders. So certainly the whole area was known as Palestine. And there is a Palestinian delegation at the UN. But that's not even, I don't even think that's terribly controversial. The biggest mistake that she made is that she just doesn't have the confidence in it that you would want her to have after she's a congressperson. But her assessment of the situation is exactly right. I mean, Hoover may be right that the geopolitical situation is different between the Palestinians and the Israelis, as opposed to what you would see in the Bronx or in Puerto Rico or in Texas or wherever. We don't have a system of dual citizenship where people who are citizens are second-class citizens in this country by law. We don't have a situation where we have embargoed, essentially, the state of Texas and not allowing supplies to come in. But beyond that, I think it was just a function of her not having the confidence. And frankly, I would put AOC's knowledge of a broad range of issues up against 80 to 90% of the sitting Congress people understanding of these issues.
Well, it did sound like she was referring to the whole region as occupied Palestine, which is probably not something you would hear a congressperson say for the most part.
I don't think she was saying the whole region. She was talking about the settlements.
Well,
so that necessarily...
Yeah, she clarified, but like at least in that first statement. And then she walked it back, and then she walked it back further after this happened. I mean, it wasn't great. And clearly she needs to learn more about this issue. But there are people on both sides who are being dumb about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, on the one hand, AOC did nothing wrong. Her answer was perfect. Probably, not true. On the other hand, there are leftists who are raking her over the coals for not for supporting the two-state solution and for not having the position that leftist anti-war activists have on it. So I think there's room for her to learn and also move a little bit more in line with some of the groups that endorse her without doing something that would be pure political suicide.
Yeah, I mean, the latter may be true. I didn't interpret what she was saying as that the whole region was occupied Palestine. I took that. I mean, when she talks about the settlements, that to me is like quite clearly she's talking about the West Bank. Nobody refers to the settlements, Haifa. But I mean, yeah.
She also needs to have, and I think everybody, I think to me this just reflects, like, in the same way with law, frankly, which might be more important, that there just needs to be training for like an actual left foreign policy. Like people like Aziz Rana need to be able to run seminars for political figures like her. But like there's a whole other separate set of talking points on Gaza as an example.
Yeah, the problem with that is
Aziz Rana is Muslim.
No. What's up?
Oh no. Were you trying to make a joke?
No, I was trying to this. You need that.
Totally.
Well, the other thing I just like to point out quickly is like she needs to know who's a hostile, charitable interviewer and who's out to get her and like going for her. And,
I think that's that's
her
actually
tone
the
of
bigger
like
problem.
like you can't give that like Margaret Hoover that sort of that tone because she'll
and
jump
I
all
also
over
think and I hate people jumping over her. I think this should be purely constructive because she's great, but I do think that the anxiety that she's having about her previous just sort of clarity on that issue is the specific fear about talking about Israel-Palestine, which people need to let go of because it actually really isn't that complicated.
Elizabeth Warren, if you're serious about foreign policy, if you're going to deign to be serious about that, you should remind yourself that there's only one candidate who's spoken in solidarity with the anti-World Bank and IMF and austerity movements taking place right now, first and foremost in Haiti and recently with some success in Ecuador. I went in depth on this last night on my program. You could check it out. Bernie Sanders and Matt Duss are putting on the table some steps towards what does a constructive post-empire U.S. foreign policy look like. Starting, by the way, with the catastrophe of Trump tearing up the Iran nuclear deal. But this goes deeper. In 2017, Bernie Sanders was the only member of the Democratic Caucus of the United States Senate to vote against additional sanctions on Iran, which helped precipitate the catastrophe we're in. Recently, Elizabeth Warren in the Council on Foreign Relations suggested that Iran needs to get back into compliance, even though the whole jettisoning of the agreement was done by the Trump administration. They're at fault, not the Iranian government, regardless of what you think of the Iranian government. And there's infinite amount of things to criticize them on. The Iran deal destruction is Trump, period. So from Latin America to the Middle East, there's real fundamental differences here. And even when Elizabeth Warren, going back several years, spoke on civilian casualties, she mainly framed it in terms of the damage on the U.S. reputation, not the innate violation of the United States costing so many lives in so many places. So there's not a plan here, along with the military budget vote increases. Look, if you care about this stuff, and I believe you are obligated to care about this stuff in the heart of empire, this is actually really bad. Another through line here. You can go back and find plenty of clips, or some clips, of Bernie Sanders echoing trash pablum and nonsense about Israel's savagery and murder of Palestinians. That's what it is. Be real. That has changed. Now, if you're like me, I want a fully open democratic society for all, that transcends an ethno-state and that has full safety, protection, and democracy for every single citizen in Israel, Palestine, of all backgrounds, living in a full, flourishing, diverse, democratic framework. There's still the lip service to the two-state solution, which has never been implemented in any way, shape, or form. Every step of the way, the Israelis have continued to construct settlements, and we'll talk a little bit more in a second about the Barak and Olmert offers. But again, this is just history. This is 2 + 2 = 4 stuff. Bernie Sanders, in the last couple of years, has been willing to speak about the savage conditions in Gaza, which it's apparently okay that over 50% of the population, can't get basic medical supplies, that there's over 70% youth unemployment, half of the population is children. They can be held in a deprived open-air prison because of Hamas talking points. That's not okay, according to any basic human rights standard. And Bernie's moved significantly on this issue. Now, Elizabeth Warren defended, even in 2014, Israel bombing UN schools in operations that took over 1,000 civilian lives. No comments on the murder of the nonviolent protesters at the Gaza border. And now she's trying to incorporate some woke talking points. But again, the only way you do anything is if you say aid is on the table, which Bernie Sanders has said. She's going to say here that aid is on the table in the case of annexation, which is something that Netanyahu's talking about. But again, the West Bank has been occupied for over 40 years. So let's be real. This is an apartheid state. This is an ongoing situation. And in addition to her total lack of commitment on this that she's demonstrated so far, this is a shaky grasp of this issue, to put it gently.
Hi, Senator Warren.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming to Rock Hill.
Thank you for coming to Rock Hill.
Thank you. My name's Nazim Yudin. I'm going to change it up just a little bit. I want to talk about foreign policy.
Good. Hi, Nazim. Good.
Over this summer, we watched 2 of our Congress members denied entry into Israel to hold Israel accountable for how our military aid is being used in the occupied territories. If you watch closely what's going on, there's news of every day homes are being demolished, roads are being ripped up, access to water is being denied to the Palestinian people. Can you tell us that as president, you will hold the military aid that we give to Israel as leverage to bring about a peaceful solution to that issue?
So thank you for this question. So let me start here. I believe in a two-state solution. This has been the official policy of the United States of America for nearly 70 years and the official policy of the government of Israel. And to do that, we need to be able to guarantee the dignity of everyone. This is what I believe in a two-state solution. So let's go there. If Prime Minister Netanyahu follows through on his plans in the West Bank, then that doesn't move anyone closer to a two-state solution. And I believe at that point, the United States of America, trying to create something stable and lasting in that region, has to be willing to use every tool at its disposal. And that means it will be time to pressure the Prime Minister if that is what he does. We just can't do this. We can't keep this up. Does that make sense? Good. Thank you.
So, okay, let's start just with the basic historical wrongs here. 70 years ago, I don't know exactly what the timeline is, but 1949, the founding of the State of Israel entailed the removal of over 400,000 Palestinians from their homes. That's, again, this is just historical fact.
Then you go to 1969, which is when after the war with the Arab states, they occupied these additional territories. Now, every single decade has brought an expansion of Israeli settlements in this area, to the point where even people who looked at this just on a basic geographic logistical level were like, 2 states is impossible. You're talking about thousands pieces of settlement construction and lots of human beings. So that's also just factually wrong. Then you had Ehud Barak offer a partial deal to Yasser Arafat, but it would not have entailed territorial integrity for a Palestinian state, so they had to reject it. Jeb Brzezinski even presented the reality of that, right? Then in 2007 or 8, Ehud Olmert, weeks away from leaving office with incredibly low popularity, offers a much more actual 2-state solution, but there's still no answer on the refugees. Remember, talking about several 100,000 families removed from their homes to support to found the state of Israel. Is there Holocaust is happening? Anti-Semitism is a violent, virulent force in the world. There's an understandable reason, but no moral justification. Those historical events of Europe do not justify the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And even under international law, it does not mean that you can disregard their rights as refugees. So there's no answer to that. In 2009, the beginning of the Obama administration, Bibi Netanyahu said he supported a 2-state solution. Netanyahu, Likud, has never changed its official policy in terms of rejecting a 2-state. And in recent years, again, in addition to ongoing savagery and murders in Gaza, they have, in partnership with overtly neo-fascist and racist parties, expanded settlement at a radical rate. And he has rejected the 2-state in the last couple of years overtly, and also actively campaigned and warned against Arab participation in Israeli politics within 1967 borders. And he's recently talked about annexing, and I think there's no doubt actually that at some point the strategy in Gaza is to make it so unbearable that maybe they will say to Gazans, hey, look, we'll get you out of here, but we want to reoccupy it. That is the greater Judea full fascist project of which Netanyahu is a part of. So during this whole process, we give them huge amounts of foreign aid. There's military agreements. There's the Iron Dome. We don't step in and intervene on 2 different road systems in the West Bank. We don't intervene on malnutrition, lack of electricity, and clean drinking water in Gaza. We don't intervene and say anything. In fact, people like Elizabeth Warren cheer them on when they're bombing UN schools and bombing hospitals and killing over 1,000 civilians. They have these nonviolent protests taking place at the borders where there are videos of the Israeli soldiers joking about murdering children, shooting them point blank as snipers. And what she is literally saying is that if an Israeli government does a formal annexation, then maybe we might put that into play. So let's be very clear. It's historically illiterate. It is definitionally dehumanizing of Palestinians, even as she talks about everybody's dignity. That is a functionally hugely racist answer. Functionally. I don't think intentionally. I think there's just a low knowledge base, and when you have a low knowledge base, you go with the consensus, and the consensus is back Israel no matter what, and Palestinians don't matter. The only one slightly challenging that is Sanders. Then, and we'll do something if annexation formally happens, also what Pete Buttigieg just put on the table. There is nothing remotely courageous or radical about that. And the idea is that if you want to even do a remote thing today, probably not even on a 2-state solution, that's basically logistically impossible, but just to say maybe you need to torture Palestinian children slightly less, you need to put aid on the table. And even that is probably too little too late, because Israel is a powerful economy, has a very sophisticated weapons industry. It uses its bombardments and killings on Gaza as a marketing campaign. They sell what they call battle-ready weapons. I would really recommend the amazing documentary that Abby Martin and Mike Persner just did, Fighting for Freedom in Gaza, which I was at the premiere of. I'll have her on my show soon. People need to watch that documentary. It's brilliant, and people really need to read up on this, because this is another area where there's a basic moral obligation, and for the first time, there's a little bit of daylight.
There's somebody with a campaign that is actually recognizing that Palestinians are actual human beings and their well-being needs to be factored into some extent. And at the very least, if we're going to pretend this two-state solution still exists, we're going to need to actually do something about it. That's Bernie Sanders. No one else is there. And in fact, I would say rhetorically, Beto O'Rourke has been significantly more courageous and clear, at least in calling Netanyahu a racist, than Warren ever is. So she's quite bad on that. And no one is worse than Cory Booker or Kamala Harris. They are atrocious on this, but they're basically irrelevant. Tulsi's not good on this. Andrew Yang is terrible on this, incidentally. Andrew Yang is really quite bad on this. But Warren is quite bad on this. I mean, really, Bernie is decent-ish, and everybody else is varying degrees of terrible and inexcusable. But this is another thing that you can't just say, oh, yeah, but foreign policy. Oh, yeah, but, your money is going to murdering and starving children. And there's one candidate that is saying, maybe we'll do something about this. All right.
Obviously, I mean, my Jewish identity has never been very strongly connected. I've been to Israel, certainly know many Israelis and Palestinians. I understand. I mean, there obviously is a distinction. If you have had a family member who's died in a terrorist attack, in a Hamas suicide bombing or rocket attack, and there's also a distinction, frankly, if you're living in occupation every day. I mean, look, I remember I spent just an afternoon, not very much time at all. I went to Ramallah and the West Bank. I was traveling with somebody. And, you go in by bus, and it's no problem. You're waved right through, and you're in a completely different reality. I mean, you're going from a tremendously wealthy country. You pass by all sorts of settlements, development, and then you go inside, and you're in, what they call this iron cage. And that's quite accurate. And waiting on the line to get back into Israel, and you're waiting online. There's no, you're online with everybody else. And this is what people go through every day. They're under the gaze of machine guns. They're moving through iron barriers to move a couple of miles in a place that they've been in generations. And, in our holidays, we have, I'm such a bad part Jew that I don't remember. I think it's Passover. We say next year in Jerusalem, right? Because that's a history of exodus and persecution of the Jewish people. Well, in today's reality, we go to Jerusalem whenever the hell we want, right? That's not a problem. But people who've lived there for generations don't have basic freedom of movement. And that needs to be accounted for. And any narrative, I think we've moved from a dehumanization narrative to a, well, both sides are idiots, we can't deal with it, throw your hands up narrative. And now I will say, well, of course, there are groups like Hamas that are disgusting and deplorable, and there are innocent people killed on both sides. If you're ignoring the fundamental asymmetry of the situation, then you have a fundamentally delusional view of the situation. And that's the bottom line.
Reports are coming in that hundreds have been injured in fresh clashes in Jerusalem. Police have fired stun grenades and tear gas at stone-throwing demonstrators inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. Plans to evict Palestinian residents from East Jerusalem to make room for Jewish settlers have fueled protests that escalated over the weekend.
Unfortunately, tensions have flared after the Israeli government had made the decision to evict Palestinians from their homes in East Jerusalem in order to make room for new housing for Jewish settlers. This has sparked a new round of conflict, clashes between Palestinians and Israeli forces in Jerusalem. The tensions have been fueled by the planned eviction of that graphic says dozens, but in reality, it's hundreds of Palestinians from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of East Jerusalem, where Israeli settlers have waged a lengthy legal battle to take over properties. Israel's Supreme Court postponed a key ruling Monday in the case, meaning today, citing these circumstances. They argue that making a decision right now would be a risky one, considering the fact that clashes are currently happening. That makes one wonder whether they've already determined that they're going to side with the Israeli government in pushing Palestinians out of their homes. But to learn a little more context into this story, let's go to this next video that does a pretty good job summarizing how this conflict came about.
There's also another issue that is fueling those tensions is the potential eviction of 4 Palestinian families from one of the Palestinian neighborhoods in Sheikh Jarrah in annexed East Jerusalem. We have been talking to one of the daughters of one of the families. They are facing eviction in favor of Jewish settlers. Let's have a look. Muna Al-Kurd is documenting everything that happens here for social media. Her family is one of 4 families facing eviction from their homes in the Palestinian neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem. Right-wing settlers could soon move in here. This is our life. As Palestinians, we are the owners of the land. We lived here legally, and everything is documented legally. They come here and occupy the place, and they want to occupy what remains of the neighborhood. This part of their house has already been taken over by Jewish settlers a decade ago, just like across the street where settlers moved into this house. They claim parts of this neighborhood is actually their land and have waged a lengthy court battle against the families.
These evictions break international law. In fact, the homes where the Palestinians live were established for Palestinian refugees after the Israeli-Jordanian war that happened in 1948. So that's important context to understand. Hamas has retaliated, and we'll get to that part of the story in just a second. But Cenk, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different elements in this story. There's the Sheikh Jarrah that started this issue in the first place. There's the raid of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and then there's the rocket fire back and forth. And of course, ultimately, the main issue is the occupation. So first on Sheikh Jarrah, let's be clear. Those are people that were evicted from their land when Israel formed in 1948 and rolled tanks over their homes. Now, these settlers say, well, I bought this back in a long time ago, and they claim the original deeds were from 1876. And so if they owned it all that time ago, over 100 years ago, then it must be theirs. So this is one thing I cannot stand about the Middle East. I used to own it before you used to own it, but I used to own it before you used to own it. My ancestors owned it 2,000 years ago, 200 years ago. Okay, if we're going back to 1876, why can't we go back to 1875? Guess who owned it then? My ancestors, the Turks. Okay, now I want it back. No, Israeli settlers, get the hell out. It's my land. Now that's absurd, right? That's absurd. Why are we having a conversation about 1876? That's equally absurd. Now the people in that house, even if you believed that nonsense, were the people who were evicted. So can they go back and get their homes? They have land deeds, they have trust, they have property deeds, etc. Can they go back and get their homes? No, they cannot. The Palestinians cannot get their homes, their former homes in Israel. Why? Because they have, let's be honest about it, and there's no dispute about this, an explicitly racist ideology that Palestinians are not allowed to have their homes. They're not allowed to have their homes back. They're not allowed to have the new homes. They're not allowed to have the old homes because they're Palestinians. Period. Period. There's no other justification. They're Palestinians. They are not allowed to have their homes, right? Well, that's the definition of racism. So that's what current policy is in Israel. So should those people be removed from Sheikh Jarrah? Absolutely not. It would be literally a war crime to violate the peace treaties that are in place to evict them. Now, why are they doing it? You had to read 12 stories to get to why it's doing it, and then it was stated as why. They said, oh, throw it in as a side. Netanyahu's having trouble forming a government.
Exactly.
Okay,
yeah.
So last week he couldn't form the government. Now his opponents are trying to form a government this week. So what does Netanyahu do? Okay, let's shake things up a little bit. Let's shake up the Sheikh Jarrah thing, and then let's raid Al-Aqsa Mosque so that Hamas will be forced to respond. And when they do, we'll pretend that we're aggrieved and we're the victims. And now big bad Netanyahu will save you by murdering more Palestinians. That is Netanyahu's strategy, flat out. And what do in the rocket attacks? Hamas attacked just as expected. One person lightly injured, okay? When Israel retaliates, and it's their first retaliation, there's a lot more to come. 20 dead, including 9 children. Oh, golly gee, we missed the Hamas activists and militants again. Again, we murdered your children. Re-elect me, I'm Benjamin Netanyahu. So Netanyahu is one of the worst, racist, most oppressive, and honestly, dictators in the world. You say, well, that's not fair, you won an election. He won an election in West Bank? I don't think so. Did he? But he occupies those lands as a dictator and murders innocent civilians and children whenever he likes. So that's what a dictator does.
Yeah, I think your assessment is actually 100% right, because this came out of nowhere. Right, all of a sudden there's this, I mean, look, there had been previous efforts to evict Palestinians from their homes and build additional settlements or additional housing for Jewish settlers. However, this form of aggression seemed to come out of nowhere and was much more aggressive than what was previously seen in regard to this particular part of the conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians. For instance, the fact that you had Israeli forces enter the mosque and use the type of aggression that they did, including flash grenades and other weaponry, obviously gives you the sense of who the aggressors were initially. And then you're right, as soon as Hamas retaliates, then you hear all of these calls for, Hamas to step down, don't act. You get the Biden administration both sidesing this story as if, they both engaged in this simultaneously and there wasn't an initial aggressor when in fact there was. And I do want to also show you some footage of what it looked like inside the mosque. They didn't just do this one night, they have now done this 2 nights in a row. Take a look. And as far as the Jewish officials go, here's what we know. Israel does continue to deny that they're engaging in any type of ethnic cleansing. However, the deputy mayor of Israel had this to say. He said that, of course, part of the wider strategy, it's part of a wider strategy of placing layers of Jews throughout the eastern half of the city. The goal, Mr. King said, is to secure the future of Jerusalem as a Jewish capital for the Jewish people.
There's no question. And when you are trying to place Israeli settlers in the middle of Arabs, so later you can claim, hey, there's just too many Jews there to give it back. That is the definition of ethnic cleansing. We would like to cleanse the Muslims out of here, replace them with other people, and then claim, well, sorry, we can't give it back to the Muslims now because we already ethnically cleansed too many of them. So look, people have attachment to Israel for a number of different reasons in America. And it blinds them from obvious things. So first of all, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They say, oh, there was some agitation inside the mosque and we had to just go and raid it with all of the material we already had ready. We already had the stun grenades ready. We had all these cops, everything ready to raid the mosque with a significant force. They injured over 300 people and put over 220 in the hospital. And they said, well, some of the police were slightly hurt as well. Oh, I'm sorry, were you hurt in your raid of one of the holiest places in the world as you were brutalizing 300 innocent civilians? Oh, did you get a scratch? Did you get a hangnail? Is that what happened? So who do you believe? So the Israeli military and the government have lied almost every single time there's been a conflict. Yes, 2 weeks later, 6 months later, the New York Times writes a story in A17. Oh, by the way, everything the Israeli military said was a total and utter lie. Right? So, and by the way, this is not particular to Israel. If you're a journalist, you should not automatically believe the government of any country. The Pentagon here in America lies all the time. As soon as an event happens, we're angels, the others are terrorists, etc. 6 weeks later, you find out we're the ones who bombed a wedding and murdered everybody inside. So that's happened. Now, Israel's judiciary is much better. Its press is mixed and interesting, etc. So don't make blanket judgments about anyone, okay? But their military, as a matter of course, lies about every confrontation, okay? So now, so that's clear on Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, and by the way, you can tell, because normally if there was anything that the Palestinians actually did, they'd be like, oh my God, a stone landed 7 feet from someone. We have it on tape. A stone was thrown. It almost hit someone, right? They don't even have any of that. They don't have any of that. It's all lies. Okay, and you see in tape after tape inside the mosque, they're praying, their shoes are off, they're inside a mosque, right? They're all scattered, it's chaotic, there's no organization, there's no barricades, there's no nothing. All right, now, the occupation itself. Look, you gotta be honest with yourselves. It's explicitly racist. Why? Well, you say, well, the Palestinians should not be able to govern themselves. Why? They're too violent. You just admitted you're a racist. What do you mean the Palestinians are too violent? What does that mean? Answer the question. What does that mean the Palestinians are too violent? If they're not too violent, why can't they govern themselves? Well, you know, we need a cooling off period. It's been over 50 years. It's been over 5 decades. What are we waiting for? Okay, what are we waiting for? No. And by the way, the Palestinians, no matter what they do, oh, you're going to go to the United Nations, try diplomacy? It's unacceptable. It's a borderline terrorism to do diplomacy, right? They did a massive protest near the wall. How dare you get near the wall? They murdered the doctors and everybody else that came anywhere near the wall. And so you can't do a peaceful protest. You can't go to mosque. You can't do anything because you're a Palestinian and we despise you for being a Palestinian. Admit it, just admit it. It's a deeply racist policy. And if America is supporting it, America is supporting racism, explicit, obvious, over-the-top racism. So one more thing about this.
But let me just jump in. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Not only does the United States support it in the context of the conflict between Israelis and the Palestinians, I mean, we support it here within our own borders. And in the case of our financial support, it doesn't matter how much Netanyahu reneges on agreements to stop building settlements. He continues to build the settlements in the Gaza Strip. We've seen these tensions flare over and over again. Things get pretty extreme in terms of the conflict every 4 years, so it's not shocking that this is happening again. And let me also note that I think the timing is important here because this coincides with Jerusalem Day, which, do you want to jump in on that? Because I think that Netanyahu specifically chose this timing in order to increase his efforts to kind of deflect from the fact that he's failed to form a government, but also remember he's also facing criminal corruption charges as well.
Yeah, and so in Jerusalem Day, they're supposed to march and show pride, etc. The Israelis are. Now it's, again, Israel is not a monolith. There's right wing, there's left wing, just like in America and just like in every country. But the ones that are the most militant are, just like in every country, the right wing, right? So they were going to march, and they were going to march through Palestinian and Muslim neighborhoods. And then right before they do that, they raid the Al-Aqsa Mosque to make sure that the powder keg is lit. So why? Because Netanyahu has to, can't form a government. So he's got to make sure that big bad Netanyahu is the only one who can protect the Israelis. This guy's Dick Cheney and Donald Trump rolled into one. Okay, he's one of the most loathsome figures in the world today. And the fact that America continues to support him, by the way, as he does not support America. He only supports America when Republicans are in charge.
Yep.
Now we have to blindly support this out of control rogue dictator who has oppressed millions of people for decades? No, the answer is no, we don't. And so anyone who goes along with that, look, it's cowardice. And so now, the arrogance of the Israeli government is unparalleled. So, but let me give it context, because one of our members, as always, smartest audience in the world, commented in Colorado Blue Blazer Regular wrote in, curious timing, the US Congress agrees that our gajillions of dollars goes to Israel without conditions, and almost immediately the Israeli government goes violent, purely coincidental, I'm sure. Why is the United States government constantly saying no conditions? You just take all of our money, and you do whatever you want, bash anyone's head in, murder anyone you like. We wouldn't do it with our greatest allies, Britain, Canada, and yes, Israel. Except Israel. We wouldn't do it with anyone but Israel. And so, no, I refuse to not use normal human judgment when it comes to this magical country. Should we protect Israel? Of course. Should we also protect the Palestinians? In Washington, they think that is an abhorrent idea. Well, I'm here to tell you, the rest of us don't think it's abhorrent. We think you're racist for saying we should not protect the Palestinians. And then so finally in their arrogance, our diplomats called Israeli diplomats, and the Israeli government tells Biden administration, you better stay out of this.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
What do you mean you better stay out of this?
And hold. Think about that statement. And also consider the fact that in 2016, Obama's administration agreed to a $16 billion military funding program for Israel. I believe it was under Obama's watch that the US government built and funded the Iron Dome for Israel in order to protect it from any adversaries. And yearly, we provide quite a bit of foreign aid to Israel, even though this is a country that provides universal health care to its citizens, well, you know what the situation in the United States is like.
Okay, so I love that we provided Iron Dome for Israel because it protects their civilians. And by the way, when Hamas fired the rockets today, Iron Dome knocked out one of the rockets. So great job. Now, I'm going to say something radical that, and again, the rest of the country will agree with me and understand it easily. People in Washington their heads will explode. Okay, how about if we do Iron Dome for the Palestinians? Oh, outrageous. You mean protect Palestinian children as we would protect Israeli children? Well, of course not. Their lives are not relevant. They're not human. Who cares if Palestinian kids are murdered as they were today? That's your implicit answer to why the Palestinians can't be protected. I love that the Israelis are protected. Why can't we do likewise for the Palestinians? Because they're Palestinians. Okay, thank you for admitting that you're racist. It is a definitely, explicitly, inarguably racist. Last thing. So the guy says, stay out of our business, right? The Israeli ambassador. Okay, I'd be glad to. We'll take all of our money back right now. Oh, no, you have to give me all your money. Why? Why do I have to give it to you? I have to give you all billions upon billions upon billions of dollars. I have to give it to you as an American taxpayer. But I'm not allowed to criticize you when you crush civilians on purpose. And then I'm supposed to stay out of your business. No. We either stay out of your business by you giving us, not only us stopping giving you money, why don't you give us all our money back? Why don't you give us the hundreds of billions of dollars that we have given Israel? Why don't you give it back, then we'll stay out of your business, okay? I didn't think so. So as long as you keep taking our taxpayer money, that's my money. That's my money. You want to take my money, then tell me to stay out of it as you go murder civilians? No deal, no deal. But of course, it doesn't matter what we yell and scream here. Let's be honest. Biden isn't going to do anything. He's going to kiss Israeli ass, and you know it. Everybody knows it. Everybody watching knows it. Every journalist and powerful person in Washington pretending to be outraged by that statement knows that that is exactly what's going to happen. No one could possibly dispute it. He'll wag his finger at most, if he dares. And he'll say, oh, they should not do that. Both sides are guilty, but Hamas is more guilty. Hamas is terrorist, right? Wait, who killed the 9 kids? Israel did. No, they're not terrorists. Who didn't kill anyone? The Palestinians. Oh, they're the terrorists. Nah, the chance of the United States government being even-handed is impossible. I'll add one last thing. This has nothing to do with Jewish Americans. I need everybody to understand that crystal clear. Jewish Americans vote for Democrats at a rate of about 70%. They're one of the most solidly progressive groups in America, okay? But when it comes to the lobbyists for the Israeli government, like lobbyists for the Saudi government, the Turkish government, the Norwegian government, okay? Do they have outsized influence in Washington, as Ilhan Omar alluded to, which she got lambasted for? Everyone in Washington knows they have outsized influence. Everyone knows that. To claim otherwise would be absurdity. It would be ridiculous. Why do you think all of our politicians, both Republicans and Democrats, kneel down in front of one country? Is it because, oh, it's the Jews control everything? No, that's insane conspiracy theories. No, it's just as simple as why do they bow down in front of the oil companies, the drug companies, the banks, the payday lenders? Because our government allows for bribery and other governments can bribe our government. It's total insanity. That's why Saudis can murder anyone they like as long as they keep spending that lobbyist money. That's the reality. People in Washington don't want to talk about it because it's ugly, because most of them take that blood money. That's just the reality. Whether it's the Saudis, the Israelis, the Ukrainians, the Russians, the Chinese, it doesn't matter. They all take the money and then they turn around and pretend to be outraged when you when you point out things that are super obvious. Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
But yeah, it's sick. I mean, you texted me that video of the kid, another medic was just shot, so.
Yeah, there was something that Bilal Muhammad, who's one of the UFC fighters, had on his Instagram, and I texted you that. It's so, again, this is another thing that's so difficult to understand what's actually going on. There's so many pro-Israel people that put their head in the sand and don't want to look at some of these atrocities and don't want to look at some of the videos that you sent me of soldiers shooting at people that are not doing anything.
Right. I mean, yeah, their whole argument is that it's all Hamas and their human shields. I mean, we looked through hundreds of hours of footage that these people gave us, and it's mind-blowing footage. It looks absolutely cinematic and epic, but the footage is harrowing, and I didn't see one weapon. I didn't see one militant, not one weapon. It was literally people with slingshots throwing rocks at tanks. It's kind of a rite of passage. It's very symbolic. They're not trying to hurt anyone. No Israeli soldiers have been hurt or killed, during 2018, which is what the film looks at, is through 2018 of the Great March of Return. And there's not any weapons. There's no militants. Hamas has nothing to do with the march. And it's just shocking. I mean, it's shocking how many war crimes were committed on camera. And it's just amazing the propaganda that's just told to us about what this is and why they have the right to kill people that pose no threat to them.
When you were on last time and you talked about this, one of my email accounts was flooded with literally a chain letter, like the same letter, like denouncing you and your lies and your anti-Semitic perspective and your anti-Israeli perspective. It was weird because it was the same email.
AstroTurfed, yeah, it was fake.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a campaign. You know that has a lot of money behind it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of money behind that. I mean, the film is mind-blowing. Go to GazaFightsForFreedom.com if you want to check it out when it gets released, and it's just really incontrovertible, Joe. I mean, even if it were a war between armies, all of these things that Israel has done are still documented war crimes and very grievous violations of international law. And we're talking about direct targeting and assassinations by Israeli snipers of disabled people, of children, medics. Press, and medics. And that's who Razan was. She was a medic, and as you mentioned, another medic just passed away, was killed, rather. I hate to use the passive voice because you always hear Palestinians died. No, they were murdered. They're all being murdered by snipers, and they pose no threat to them. And so the film looks at this UN investigation basically during the march in 2018 and documents all of the grievous crimes and atrocities conducted by the Israeli military. And I mean, Palestine has a right to defend itself. And this isn't even what that is. But if you look at the UN Charter of 1978, they say that, occupied peoples and besieged peoples have the right actually for armed self-defense. And the fact that this is not even what that is, that there's literally people going out there in peace with their bared chests, holding flags, and they're getting killed and sniped. There's so many amputations. I mean, just in 2018 alone, there was 35 kids who were killed. 900 shot.
Jesus.
Yeah, that's children. And some of these stories are harrowing. A kid hiding behind a trash can who was sniped. A kid who went up to the fence and just put a Palestinian flag and she was shot in the head and died instantly. It goes on and on and on. And so, we're just trying to document this to really kind of push the needle for accountability, because these laws have been agreed upon by the international community, some of them 100 years ago. And to have kind of a rogue state acting with complete impunity, knowing that it has total protection from the U.S. empire and given more freedom than ever under Trump with this Golan Heights thing and the moving of the Jerusalem embassy, or the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem. I mean, it's abysmal, and it needs to be stopped. And, they can't control the narrative any longer because we're seeing this with our own eyes. And that's what this film does, is really lays it all out.
Abby, you concentrate and focus on so many different fucked up parts of the world. But you're very friendly and upbeat. Like you're laughing at this. How do you manage to maintain your sanity? Because I have a hard time if I just watch one of your pieces.
Right.
I watch one of your clips and I just go, what the fuck? And I just want to cry and I don't know what to do and I want to hug my kids. But you're in the trenches every day and you go to these places all the time. How do you do it?
Well, I think that, first of all, I go and camp a lot. I get into nature a lot, which is also kind of depressing, knowing that, climate change and blah, blah, blah. But I try to get out and see the beauty of the world and understand my privilege, especially as an American citizen, because we can't afford to not be aware, and we can't afford to not be educated and talking about these issues, especially when our government is subsidizing this around the world, $10 million every day with our tax dollars. This is going on, and it's so close to home. And we have to acknowledge our privilege and acknowledge the situation, which is we have agency. We have agency to lobby our government to change this and to stop these criminal acts.
Hi.
Hi.
So my first question, it says on your Twitter that you're Jewish. Am I getting this right?
No.
Is it the right Twitter?
On my Twitter bio, it says I'm Jewish?
No, but in your tweets. I don't want to be wrong.
I have Jewish background. I'm just trying to think of...
Okay, so as someone with a Jewish background,
yes,
how do you feel about Bernie's plan for Israel, especially as someone concerned with foreign policy?
I love it. It's absolutely necessary. My Jewish values teach me to oppose apartheid.
Okay. Could you elaborate, please?
There really isn't that much to elaborate on. Has anybody ever been not only to Israel but also to the? Have you been to? Have you been to the West Bank? Have you been to Gaza?
Yep.
You went to Gaza?
I went to the border.
Oh, okay, but not to Gaza.
You can't be in Gaza.
Well, I know people who've gone to Gaza. You could definitely go to Gaza. So for me, my politics are built on a base of, economic justice and actually really anti-racism, as in some ways as distinct from some of this sort of woke stuff in a way. But when I was already, I grew up, I was pretty connected to left politics, so I always knew growing up about the travesty that was the human rights situation there. And I knew that people I admired, like Nelson Mandela said, South Africa is going to not be properly free until the Palestinians are free. In 2006, I believe, I read a piece by a guy named Tony Judt in the New York Review of Books, who was a really important Jewish scholar. And he just said, the argument was that, literally this is childish. The idea that you have an ethno-state or a religious state, if you're committed to any type of broad-based social, economic equity and civil society, it doesn't work. No matter how justified, right? Of course there's justification because of Jewish history for Israel. There's justification for Kurdistan because of Kurdish reality. There's justification for Pakistan. It's notable that Israel and Pakistan are both disasters. Israel not in the sense of, look, if you're a European Jewish background, you have a nice life there. If you're not, you are, even inside 67 borders, not a fully equal citizen. And the situation in the West Bank is, it is literally Jim Crow-like, And Gaza is, I mean, it's just an atrocity. So that's not something that anybody could reasonably ask me to support. And I understand, you know, yeah, there's some actions from some Palestinian groups that, you know, we can condemn. In fact, those have not even really been in any way seriously in play since like 2003. And when we talk about, you know, look, and the apartheid word specifically is both used by people who were crucial in ending apartheid in South Africa, like Desmond Tutu or Ronnie Kasrils, who served as intelligence minister under Mbeki, who I've interviewed. And the other main people who use the apartheid word are Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak. So it is what it is. And I don't support second-class citizenship and occupation and sieges for anybody, no matter who they are.
Are you not concerned about the binary between either condemning Israel entirely, being like also a stance that a lot of like very strong and notorious anti-Semitic people agree with, versus like, you know, seeing this as more of a complex issue where it is wrong what's going on, and there's also a way to do this that Israel still exists and is supported?
So it's not a complex issue. That's the big thing. It's super simple. There's one group that has enormous power. It's the most powerful country in the Middle East. It's backed by the United States. It acts on another population of people with total impunity and is never held accountable for anything. So there's no symmetry in the relationship, period. And just as like a thought experiment, IDW people, if we know that if somehow a population of Jewish refugees ended up in West Bank and Gaza, and an Arabic government in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv had an open-air prison in what, you know, Jewish Gaza, which they bombed with white phosphorus. They killed civilians indiscriminately, and they had no provisions for medicine. They had an embargo that blocked food, that the electricity wasn't running, that there was an over 48% unemployment rate. Life expectancy and malnutrition statistics were horrifying. One of the major policymakers in this hypothetical Arabic Palestinian state said, we need to put those Jews on a diet. In the West Bank, there was another Jewish area where there was a little bit more autonomy, but there was regular Arabic settlements where they pulled up the Jewish farmers' foods. They terrorized them with rocks. The security forces broke children's bones, and they couldn't drive their own roads. We'd all have no problem understanding what that was. So there's nothing complex about it. The second part of your question, it's a pure asymmetry relationship. And the question is rights or not. So that's it. It's not complicated. The second part of your question, at this point, there's always going to be crackpots who are anti-Semitic who condemn Israel. That's not what drives the movement, particularly in the United States. If you work around most people who are concerned with this issue, it's actually populated with a lot of Jewish people. The real question we have to ask is, why is it that AIPAC is hosting an information minister for Slobodan Milosevic? Why is it that there's relationships between the Israeli government and far-right parties in Europe? Why is it that Benjamin Netanyahu's son is posting borderline alt-right memes? Why is it that Israel is an alt-right state, even though it is from the descendants of the victims of one of the greatest crimes in history? That's a serious question, and that's inseparable from the racism of the project, which goes back to the first part that we have to solve. But thank you. Shalom. And I am serious about it coming from Jewish values. Like Tony Judd, my reading, to the extent I do, which I actually do have some connection to that in a religious sense, it's unacceptable for me. But yeah, no, I know. We'll but it's not complicated.
Well, I want to do the. You want to do the two stories after Anna, or let's do two quick stories. So one, this is really important. Peter Beinart was on CNN, and this story. First of all, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib are going to be targeted by Republicans. They're going to be race-baited and demonized by Trump. They're going to be lied about by Fox News, all of this stuff. And the real striking cowardice and disgusting sort of breakout is the Chuck Schumers, the Nancy Pelosi's, the people who will throw them under the bus. The broader context and the broader reality is that everything that they're saying about what Israel and Palestine is this is objective reality. I mean, the objective description of Israel being a Jim Crow system in the occupied territories this is analogous. I mean, this is as close, and I'm always resisting this because politics is not math. It is not science, and it is not solved by those means.
It's not logic?
It is not logic. Those are second-order tools. But you have to understand power. You have to understand history. You have to understand the deeper dynamics that actually drive politics. But the objective description of what the situation is, what apartheid is in the Middle East, in Israel-Palestine, is, on the face of it, some of the most simple and clear things to understand in politics. If you have a historical understanding of the American South, if you have an understanding of apartheid South Africa, pre-democratic South Africa, you understand that. If you have an understanding of Western Sahara, some dynamics in Northern Ireland, though, frankly, even though it was colonized and highly repressive, definitely not repressive to the same degree that the Palestinians are oppressed. And you have a siege in Gaza. We can talk about the different political dynamics within Palestine. And as I always say, on one hand, it is absurd and ludicrous for anybody to demand and pass judgment on how anybody wages their struggle in a real situation like this. That is separate. So violence versus nonviolence, we have no comment on. That's not for us to talk about. We could talk about it strategically, maybe. Things like blowing up a roller skating rink of teenagers, which absolutely has happened in the past and Hamas is engaged in. Yes, we have to categorically reject that as wrong, because if we don't categorically reject certain tactics wielded by anybody, then we don't have a ground upon which to sort of establish some commonalities. That's apparent, and that's fine. But the reality is that the broader question of the rhetoric around struggle and violence of Palestine, nobody outside of Palestine should have any comment on it. Period. Full stop. Case closed. And also on a practical level, every discussion about violence, so-called, from the Palestinians, even though that has pretty much been entirely a non-factor, essentially in reality, for at least a decade, unless we're going to get into some type of farcical kites conversation, is whataboutism to obscure the resistance to apartheid. And the great irony is that the prime vehicle of that resistance that has any impact in the world is nonviolent boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which those who defend Israel anywhere, anytime, any place are more upset about than anything else. Peter Beinart is a moderate. He has a background as a far-right hawk. I guess he would call himself a liberal interventionist in terms of foreign policy. But he's a man of conscience. And really, I will say this as someone who spent some brief time in Ramallah myself, you would have to be devoid of any basic human response to not be disgusted by that situation. And this was a very important sort of clarity on CNN.
Palestinians don't have to be saints in order to deserve the basic rights that all of us take for granted, right? Miftah has said things that I disagree with. They made an anti-Semitic statement that they apologized for. The point is, when you go there, I say this as an American Jew. My children go to Jewish day school. I lead services in an Orthodox synagogue. Judaism is the center of my life. The first time I went to spend time with Palestinians in the West Bank, it was a shattering experience. The only thing I could imagine would be similar for American would be going to visit the Jim Crow South. When you see people living under the control of the state with no rights, They cannot become citizens. They cannot vote for the state that controls their lives. They do not have free movement. They need a pass to move from city to city. They live under a military legal system. The consequences are more brutal than we can imagine sitting here. So do I agree with Miftah? Of course not. I had a close friend who was killed in a suicide bombing. But Palestinians don't. You could have made the same argument if you went to visit SNCC and said, oh, they were connected with communists. Some of their people have made anti-white statements. The point is, what Ilhan Omar said is the most important point. People need to go and see for themselves. I've never seen anyone who's gone and seen for themselves and not been transformed by the experience.
Anyone to be associated with a group that supports terrorism, and this is in black and white. I mean, they publish this stuff. No one's forcing them to publish
years
this
ago,
stuff.
there were certain statements on their website. Hana Nasrawi has devoted her life as a nonviolent activist to opposing an oppression which none of us which does not accord with the values that any of us believe in as Americans.
So she doesn't control her own organization and what it publishes?
Rich, why don't you try spending a little bit of time focusing on the fact that almost $4 billion of U.S. aid is used to put children in detention.
You're the one distracting from the issue. I'm asking you.
This is the issue. You're distracting from the issue because National Review, just as National Review defended apartheid, and just as you defended segregation, you now defend Israel's oppression of Palestinian basic rights. It's a tradition for you guys.
Look, and if an organization supports terrorism, that organization should be beyond the pale.
And when Palestinians protest non-violently, right, you discredit them as well.
So you're saying that, in some sense, justifies terrorism?
Of course it doesn't justify what I've said again and again, I disagree with terrorism. What I'm saying is you're trying to distract from the real issue. The real issue is American complicity in the denial of basic Palestine.
Well, first of all, it's 100% right. And yes, it's absolutely, you are the legacy heir of apartheid and Jim Crow South if you defend Israel in its occupation and siege and denial of democratic rights. More broadly, I mean, this is something that's extraordinary to me because everybody picks their place to not want to, in this case, acknowledge the fundamental issue, which is the oppression of Palestinians. And two, nobody wants to deal with the simple, but apparently for a lot of people, disturbing reality that reasons and understanding is not justification. And that's an understanding that you need to apply to any number of situations in order to have a proper analysis. You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS or it's no news to anybody who has any cognitive or emotional capacity that Donald Trump is a racist, he's a buffoon, he's grotesque, he's disgusting. The man has concentration camps. And I think it's actually very important in this context to remind people that the context and the ability to do that policy was implemented by both the creation of ICE under a Homeland Security package signed by George W. Bush and some very aggressive deportation policies in the Obama-Biden administration. Now, as I've always said, though, this is not just a difference of degree, it's a difference of kind. And Donald Trump is characterized by strategic white supremacy. And the Republican Party is characterized by strategic white supremacy in the sense that for some people, this is a genuine, disgusting conviction. For other people, it's just the fact that they see the writing on the wall and that a fusion of oligarchy and white identity politics is the Republican Party. And that's why a combination of voter suppression and terrorizing immigrants is the electoral path they see. And I'm not drawing a false equivalency. There is absolutely no false equivalency. The worst Democrat you can name does not represent white supremacy and the level of severity of threat that Donald Trump does. That's objectively true. What's also objectively true is that the Democratic leadership is just so utterly free of morals, courage, strategic capacity, political instincts, political toughness, and almost all of their leadership are preoccupied by the most narrow pedestrian concerns. It's increasingly clear that people like Nancy Pelosi and Hakeem Jeffries are more interested in controlling a caucus than the country. They're not going to go to the mat for children in concentration camps, and they're certainly not going to go to the map for the 4 prime leaders actually showing leadership in Congress today. This should be a surprise to no one. I mean, look, we were talking a couple of months ago when Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer went to AIPAC, and forget your position on Israel-Palestine, whether you support a 67 two-state solution, whether you support a binational democracy. AIPAC is a racist, far-right, xenophobic, nationalistic, extremist organization. They went there and they co-signed on slanders and smears and lies about Ilhan Omar that could, let's be blunt, jeopardize her life. That's who Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi are. Is it any mystery that in the same week that Nancy Pelosi is having, I'm guessing, cocktails with the not relevant since she said Al Gore shouldn't, Al Gore was weird because he wore earth tones or whatever the fuck Maureen Dowd is. Maureen Dowd is talking with Nancy Pelosi and Rahm Emanuel, recycling, in Rahm Emanuel's case, maybe the most despicable person in Democratic politics. The laundering, moral cowardice, and no strategic vision. That's the last thing I want to say here about these Democratic leaders. It's not just, it would be one thing if their utter amorality had a political upside. All they are doing is pissing off and alienating a emerging base, and they're doing something that's more ephemeral but actually matters, which is they are looking like confused cowards to normal people, and that doesn't sell well. This actually sells well from Ilhan Omar because she's speaking clearly.
With those who protest against them in Charlottesville. This is a president who has openly violated the very value our country aspires to uphold: equality under the law, religious liberty, equal protection, and protection from persecution. And to distract from that, he's launching a blatantly racist attack on 4 duly elected members of the United States House of Representatives, all of whom are women of color. This is the agenda of white nationalists. Whether it is happening in chat rooms or it's happening on national TV, and now it's reached the White House garden. He would love nothing more than to divide our country based on race, religion, gender, orientation, or immigration status, because this is the only way he knows he can prevent the solidarity of us working together across all of our differences. The only way to prevent us confronting the problems our country is facing, whether it is healthcare, climate change, student debt, or our endless wars. This is his plan to pit us against one another. This is how he can continue to enrich his friends and distract us from the detrimental policies that his administration is pushing forth.
That's leadership. That's clarity. And if you have 3 different positions right now, which is Donald Trump is doing his thing. He's doing race war politics. He doesn't even have the ability to lie and bullshit and fake economic populism. He's been a pure 1% Republican. This is all he's got. So then you have a clear response and clear leadership. And by the way, I can't help but be reminded of that asshole Tucker Carlson who does fake populism too. That is precisely the same sentiment that the Somali labor organizer is talking about in the Amazon strike. She is calling upon the best ideals of this country and saying precisely that You need to work in common efforts across lines to take on oligarchy, inequity, ecological crisis, get people health care, and cancel student loan debts. And yes, that's exactly right. The byproduct of all of this bloated bigotry and entitlement is redistribution of wealth to wealthy people. That's it. And then Schumer and Pelosi want to sit there and hold the ball and run out the clock. The problem is that you can't, this isn't a basketball game, to do the sports analogy. When you're holding a ball, where on the other side of that ball, that game, is people, not just children. Let's say people. Rashida Tlaib actually really eloquently underlined that. People in concentration camps. A deal to send a chunk of those people to Guatemala, which is run by a far-right government backed by the United States that is mired in corruption and abuses, so it can be another outsource for more of our problems that we create. So that's the leadership. And that is a perfect distillation of the three choices we have here. And I will say again, I want to just, the only other thing we'll do is we got to play this CNN clip because that's just disgusting. But this is another area. I didn't even say it with Bessner, but on foreign policy, yes, the power that a president has over foreign policy, this is another reason why you absolutely need to vote for Bernie Sanders. And today, Bernie Sanders, just as he has used his email list to warn people about ICE raids, to help support strikers, to help support people providing vital health services for women in states where medieval abortion assault laws are being passed, he put out a tweet and an email today saying, do a 4-way split donation to Ayanna Pressley, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib. None of these people have even endorsed him, by the way. Just to be really clear about that. A couple of months ago, he had by far the most unequivocal and clear statement about Ilhan Omar. Period. When the rubber meets the road, whether it is voting against defense budgets, whether it is voting against military-industrial complex budgets, whether it is highlighting the work of grassroots activists, that's why he has anti-gentrification activists with him on stage in Chicago, whether it is coming out and not just putting out a tweet or doing the thing that they all do. I mean, everybody's got the Donald Trump is an asshole tweet. Nancy Pelosi's tweets are an art form. Donald Trump is a massive bigoted asshole, and we should work together on roads. Donald Trump knows how to roll these people. Bernie Sanders is showing up. And I'm sorry, that is more important than wonkery. That's movement building. That's leadership. That's something to somebody's core. It's not that he's the best. He's of a different kind. And I won't even go into it, but apparently there's some fucking morons complaining that he did this. That just shows that we're at a state of nonsense here that, we're going to have to narrow who we can even answer on this show, because some people are just, off in whatever ridiculous, rabbit hole. The hatred of him is bizarre. But the leadership and the record is clear. We need to play this because this is the corollary. This is the press version of the Democratic leadership. Now we're going to say, if you're Donald Trump and you're part of these white, bigot brigades, that Ilhan Omar sympathizes with Al-Qaeda. Now, it will go without saying that not only does she not sympathize with Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda would murder her, if we're being real about this. Now, that is a smear. It's a lie. It's fundamentally dishonest. It's bigoted. It's grotesque. And the only way of asking her about this is, are you disturbed that the rhetoric is escalating like this? Are you concerned about this new level of fear-mongering and dishonesty? But this reporter, and I thought it was a CNN reporter, but is this a Fox reporter?
Well, the clip is from Fox. I don't know who the reporter is.
I thought the reporter was from CNN. Regardless, we'll find this out later. This is a reporter at this very same press conference asking Ilhan Omar if that is true.
Of you, can you respond to some of the president's specific claims, most notably that you're a communist and that you're pro-Al-Qaeda?
You might have noticed how when he said, go back to where you came from, there was an uproar through all of our communities, because every single person who's brown and black at some point in their life in this country heard that. Now, when he made the comment, I know that every single Muslim who has lived in this country and across the world has heard that comment. And so I will not dignify it with an answer.
That's exactly right. You won't dignify it with an answer. It's disgusting. It's grotesque. And, you know, look, we talked a lot about, on a show that we used to do, Two Dope Boys on a Podcast, my friend Phil McKenzie, and Matt produced that. We used to talk a lot about how there are no sidelines. And I think that this is a clear example of any. And, you know, that this is a choice of literally your basics of what you support. Period. This is not obscure debate. This isn't social media controversy. This isn't even a time for tactical calculation. The President of the United States is using eliminationist rhetoric against women of color who are massively significant political leaders. And they have been consistently portrayed and undermined by their own party leadership. And that's why look, you can disagree with these particular people. I don't think there's any room for disagreement on the concentration camps. But this is absolutely outside of the realm of political debate and distinction. This is fundamentally, where are you at, who are you with, and how do you move? And the fact that by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer have undermined them every step of the way has emboldened. I'm not saying that Trump wouldn't do this anyways, but you make the attack significantly more open. Now, conversely, you've created a situation where who's more important to the country right now? Ilhan Omar is more important than Nancy Pelosi right now. Ayanna Pressley is more important than Richard Neal right now. AOC is certainly more important than fucking Steny Hoyer. And Rashida Tlaib is more important than Chuck Schumer. Now, not institutionally. Institutionally, this is still the sclerotic, dysfunctional, corporate compromised hackery of the Democratic leadership. But the energy of the country is here. And if someone like Maureen Dowd thinks that this is scaling woke back mountain because you're clear that the same president who helped run the media lynch mob against the Central Park Five, and I use that word quite consciously, called for killing them, called for bringing back the death penalty for them, and has still not apologized to this day, even as they were innocent, that there is no room, you know. So she calls it scaling woke back mountain, I believe is the last, and it's just funny to me as somebody who understands the Vampire Castle essay as an example, which people always should read by Mark Fisher. This has nothing to do with that. This is fundamentally, as Bill Fletcher Jr. would say, about whether democracy is real or not, about whether you take humanity seriously, about whether you take any type of serious anti-racist project seriously. So people like Maureen Dowd are making themselves quite clear. They don't take any of these things seriously, and they prefer to kibitz and gossip about these four who are showing more leadership and are at more personal risk than anybody else in this whole situation. Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, Hakeem Jeffries, all that. It's disgusting. It's pathetic, and they need to be primaried.
We're going to focus on the candidate running against Elliot Engel. We're going to focus more. There's a great candidate running against Steny Hoyer. I'd like to see somebody taking a look at Hakeem Jeffries. Apparently, Hakeem Jeffries is in charge of the House Democrats' Twitter account. And if you don't think that the cynical weaponization of neoliberal, quote unquote, identity politics would only be used against Bernie Sanders, don't be naive. This is a cynical political tactic of people who have no commitment to anything and nothing to sell. They will use it even as these women's lives are literally at risk. So, as always, we stand with Ilan. Oh, I guess that's the perfect example of this. This is, what is this, Matt?
Well, this is the original House Democrats tweeted out by Michael Hardaway, who works for Hakeem Jeffries, about Sekhet Chakrabarti, who was criticizing the vote for, I think, more border funding.
And he made the point. This is a guy who works for, he's
AOC's chief of staff.
right? And this is a really important point because this is a systemic understanding. The Democratic leadership tried to get him into a rabbit hole because they talked about a congresswoman named Sharice David, I believe.
Sharice David, who's in Kansas.
Right. She's a Native American congresswoman who represents Kansas, and she's a conservative Democrat. And she voted for the border bill. Now, and precisely because this is an anti-essentialist argument, and the point is actual structure here. That's why you see these disgusting conservatives. What's their new thing? Their new big thing is, oh, look, there's Hispanic guards at the concentration camp. You don't think that woman wasn't strategically placed there to be in the shot with Lindsey Graham and Mike Pence? I mean, first of all, I don't know how fucking naive people are. And secondly, that's irrelevant. Yes, it's absolutely racist. And yes, absolutely people can participate in racist structures regardless of their background. That's what he said. I think the point still stands. I don't think people have to be personally racist to enable a racist system. The same could be said of the Southern Democrats. I don't believe Sharice is a racist person, but her votes are showing her to enable a racist system. Yes, she voted for the border bill without accountability. That is quite literally, that is enabling a racist system we see every day. We read the reports of the secret ICE Facebook groups. Anybody with a modicum of, anybody who's not Dave Rubin should be able to process that point. But apparently the House Democrats can't.
Yeah, it's because it's fairly clear what happened is Sekhet was generally criticizing the border funding, and then someone says, well, what about Sharice Davids?
What about Sharice Davids? But by the way, if you really want to get into that rabbit hole, what a cynical deployment of her.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. That's like, what about Candace Owens fucking saying George Floyd deserved to die? What about her? What the fuck?
This guy, and why is he explicitly singling out a Native American woman of color? Her name is Congresswoman Davids, not Sharice.
Oh my God, liberal identity politics is so cringe. Oh my God, it's so cringe. I'm cringing right now. I'm literally cringing.
She's a phenomenal new member who flipped a seat blue. Keep her. Then they have the hand emoji out of.
Oh, it's gross. I hate Hakeem Jeffries. I mean, I don't know what he's like these days, but back at this point, bro, I was like, I literally am gonna move back to New York and try to primary this person. That's how odious of a figure he is. Weaponized identity politics, vapid, disgusting. It's just what liberals do. I mean, it's just disgusting because real life issues affecting Native Americans. I don't know. This was pre-George Floyd, so maybe Hakeem Jeffries is more woke now. But I'm sure he wouldn't give a fuck about any kind of systemic problems dealing with Native Americans. It's just the representation of one in Congress Like if Sharice Davids was like quote unquote woke like AOC, like it was part of the squad, they would fucking hate her. They would never stick up for her like this. It's only because she's towing the party line, or it's just it's disgusting.
Her mouth. Now, of course, the House Democrats are doing this a couple of days after Nancy Pelosi, among other things, said apparently to a meeting of Democrats in the House, keep it off Twitter. Now the official Twitter account will try to humiliate and get one of your members of your staff fired. But besides that, certainly don't advocate against concentration camps on Twitter. Then we have Pelosi Deputy Chief of Staff Drew Hamill on why he retweeted this obnoxious, disgusting House Democrats tweet. I retweeted this in my personal capacity as a gay man who was bullied and beaten in high school.
Not sure what that has to do with anything.
Run in. I literally have no idea what that has to do with anything, other than it's craven and cynical. And I'm assuming that. But look,
You said on why I retweeted this. I retweeted this in my personal capacity as a gay man. What? What? Bro, they don't even know how to do it right. Like they just like throw out identity like it's a Pokemon. It's like, oh shit, I'm in trouble. I was gay. or just anything. Like as a serious this is why we need like a serious person can't take this.
Don't see a through line. You know,
there's no through line. There's no so the guy criticizes Sharice Davids for voting for that bill last year, I for ICE, because he called her Sharice. I guess you can call her Sharice. They like to play these civility games. And was she a Native American? That has nothing to do. It has nothing to do with it. She a phenomenal member who flipped to see blue. Oh, so this is what he's saying. I mean, this is if you want to be charitable. This part is whatever, but this part, she's a phenomenal new member who flipped a seat blue. Could be interpreted as charitably. Look, man, she's like Joe Manchin. Well, not really, but she's a frontline Democrat in the swing district, so she has to be a little bit racist. So, and I mean, relax, calm down. She can't really vote against this bill. Well, I don't believe that's true because polling does indicate that Americans are not like cool on immigration like that. But within so that it's just like you always have to think about how these people think about it. It's always like some bullshit. I would say fight for it anyway. You're not in an election season. She just won. So therefore, move people's opinions on it in the meantime. That's what I would say. And as far as her name is Congresswoman Davids, I get it. If some person, Tucker Carlson was like Alexandria, I mean, whatever. I get the civility of it all. That's why it's good to play the civility game. Just play it. But hit it with the same critique. Congressman Davids would have been the same. That would have took this whole line out, this whole dumbass line out. So we would have to focus on this, which doesn't make any sense. I mean, Hakeem Jeffries would get destroyed in the debate if you would. It's just wow.
I'm not going to do standpoint epistemology here. I'm going to say, and I am a straight male,
I don't see a through line between being terrorized and physically assaulted because of your sexuality in high school and caping for putting children in concentration camps. I don't.
It's what you have to do. Hurt people. Don't you understand, Michael? I was hurt, therefore I need to hurt. I mean, that's not the point of the phrase, but that's how I interpreted it. Oh my God.
See that connection. Maybe you'll have to enlighten me.
There's no connection. It's actually just like it's just woke identity politics. Woke. It's just like you said, ephemeral. It's just like gay. As like a just a sprinkling of cover for voting for a bullshit ass bill.
I would suggest that if that's your only rationale for retweeting that, days after you yourself, we can go here, retweeted the stuff about, keeping stuff off of Twitter. See, look here's the tweet where he retweets it.
Right.
Right before it, talking about that inside meeting where where Pelosi said stop tweeting about their colleagues. So right afterwards, and I'd say, look, Drew, if high school is getting back to you, you should probably resign and process that a little bit more because you're fucking the party up.
Indeed. This is disgusting. I mean, it's just so. It's like.
It's lit. Yeah.
You talk about these overused words like gut check time. I mean, children in concentration camps, children dying as we speak. Then let's broaden it. I mean, let's be really wild here. How about people in concentration camps? How about refugees from our foreign policy, primarily in concentration camps? And then let's also just add, other pieces of information like readily available that, well, one, again, children have died. And also, I don't know, things like the secret Facebook group with memes of this woman you're belittling being sexually assaulted by the president, with talks, mocking the same people whose care you're supposedly in charge of, that we already know these people are dying and being tortured and being mistreated. Footage of lawyers saying, toothbrushes are extra privilege. Fuck that. Because that's administration policy. And you have time to play these pathetic fucking games with the only 4 Congress people showing serious leadership on this? I mean, a couple of other really honorable exceptions. Fucking Ed Markey, of all people, senator from Massachusetts, is there doing serious videos, talking about it, showing some actual humanity. I don't know what the fuck is wrong with these people.
This is a moment of moral clarity where you have to be able to look at what's going on right now, and you need to be able to stand against evil and wickedness.
You know what's crazy? This is all pre-George Floyd, so... But this is also, I don't know.
And the fact that there's people in the Democratic Party who are cynically, taking this moment of clarity and muddying it up with their own personal stuff is so sick and so cynical and so beyond the...
It's like, it's just like, it's just abstract for them. It's just, they're playing politics where people are actually fighting and dying. And they're just like, make sure she's Congressman Cerise Davis to you, buddy. It's like, what the fuck are you talking about right now? These people will get destroyed in debate. That's what I'm saying. If he brought that type of bullshit to a debate with a real person, you could act like, it's like, what is, I mean, you have to be, I mean, a white man could do it, but it'd be more difficult.
For anyone who has a conscience or a heart. I mean, this is not something that we should be equivocating on or being cowardly about. I mean, this is quite literally one of the worst human crises that's occurred within our nation in decades. And the fact that these people are being so cowardly and then trying to stand behind, anti-racism, You know, it's like, oh, you can't criticize us because, you know, then you would be being
Well, the cynical
I mean,
deployment
that's so
of I mean, look, that is pure.
Exactly. That bullshit.
Pure standpoint epistemology, pure identity. That's wrong. That's a dead end. If it's deployed that way, that is not the same as the. I mean, in fact,
And
the
it's going to be too
argument-
appealing for them to not deploy it that way.
Right. Exactly. I mean, the fundamental argument of humanity, anti-racism, anti-bigotry, is these 4 congresswomen who face more sexism, more bigotry than anybody, and are the ones saying, not the fucking clap hands emoji and all this bullshit. They're saying, don't let children die in concentration camps because of, incidentally, a fucking ethnic cleansing policy that's emanating from the White House, and you just voted on a clean bill for it. So save your fucking emojis and your memes and all your dumb talk and get back to why you're actually here, or not.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, get back to it. It's like they were never there. I mean, I didn't know about Hakeem Jeffries' run. Maybe he was there, but it doesn't seem like.
Because that actually probably is why you're here. So please just get the fuck out.
And I would also say, for anybody listening to this show, when moments like this happen, don't be one of those people saying, you know, let's all come together, right? This is the time to really, like, strain these tensions, because
Come together and do what?
they need to learn their lesson.
They need to learn their lesson. Well, I mean, power just needs to be reconfigured. You've just watched a Michael.
We're going to end the stream now. It was fun, but it's time.